During the late 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was divided into many different kingdoms, and each one was trying to become more powerful and gain greater control. The country now known as Spain had not yet been formed. Instead, two strong kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, were among the most important powers. They were deeply involved in political struggles, wars, and agreements with other kingdoms. Then, in the year 1469, an important marriage changed the direction of Spanish history. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon was much more than the union of two royal families. It was a carefully planned political decision and a strong alliance that brought together two of the most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. For the first time, the idea of creating one united Spain became a real possibility. Isabella, the daughter of King John II of Castile, was a strong and determined ruler. She was well known for her intelligence and her deep Catholic faith. Ferdinand, the son of King John II of Aragon, was also very ambitious. He had a sharp mind for planning, government, and diplomacy. At first, many people did not support their marriage because Castile and Aragon were different kingdoms with different interests. Even so, many believed that their marriage could become the beginning of a stronger monarchy that would later shape the future of Spain. Their marriage did not create a single united country right away. Castile and Aragon remained separate kingdoms. Each kingdom continued to have its own laws, traditions, government, and lands. Even though they ruled together, each kingdom kept its own identity. As time passed, Ferdinand and Isabella slowly brought more power under their control. Their joint rule created the early foundations of what would later become one united nation. During the years that followed, Isabella and Ferdinand worked closely together to make their rule stronger. Isabella had to fight for her right to rule Castile because several rivals wanted the throne for themselves. She refused to give up her claim and continued to defend her position. Even though many powerful nobles opposed her, she secured her place as queen in her own right. Her determination and strong leadership helped her gain the respect of many people throughout the kingdom. Ferdinand focused on increasing the influence of Aragon around the Mediterranean Sea. He supported military campaigns that helped expand Aragon's power, especially in Naples and Sicily. While each ruler governed a different kingdom, they understood that working together would make both kingdoms stronger. Their marriage became more than a family relationship. It also became a partnership built on shared goals and a common plan for the future. Their combined leadership marked the beginning of a new period in the history of Spain. Although their marriage created a strong partnership, many problems still remained. Ferdinand and Isabella soon understood that bringing Castile and Aragon closer together would require much more than sharing the throne. Both kingdoms had complicated political systems, different traditions, and many powerful groups that wanted to protect their own interests. The king and queen had to deal carefully with these challenges if they wanted to strengthen their rule. After the death of her brother, King Henry IV, Isabella became Queen of Castile. However, her claim to the throne was questioned by many powerful nobles. Some believed that she should not rule because her brother had been the previous king. These disagreements created political unrest across the kingdom. Several noble families tried to weaken her authority and reduce her power. Isabella remained determined to protect her crown. She showed courage, confidence, and skill as a ruler. Through careful leadership and firm decisions, she defended her position and strengthened her control over Castile. Ferdinand also faced difficulties in Aragon. Even though he was king, his authority was not complete in every part of his kingdom. Different political groups and local leaders challenged his decisions and tried to increase their own influence. He had to deal with disagreements and struggles while managing the affairs of Aragon. Despite these problems, Ferdinand and Isabella continued to work together with trust and mutual respect. They believed that only by remaining united could they increase their power and secure the future of their kingdoms. One of the greatest tasks they faced was completing the Reconquista. This was the long campaign that had lasted for many centuries to take back the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella became rulers, Christian kingdoms had already regained most of the peninsula. However, the Kingdom of Granada remained under Muslim control. Granada was the last Muslim kingdom in the region, and Ferdinand and Isabella believed that bringing it under their rule was necessary to unite Spain under Christian leadership. The war against Granada lasted for many years and demanded great effort. Ferdinand used his military knowledge to lead the Christian armies during the fighting. Isabella supported the campaign in many important ways. She made sure that enough money was available to pay for the war and provide supplies for the soldiers. She also became closely involved in organizing the movement of food, weapons, equipment, and other resources needed by the army. She worked to make sure that the forces remained prepared and properly organized throughout the campaign. The war required patience, careful planning, and continuous support. Both rulers remained fully committed to achieving their goal. Their religious beliefs also strengthened their determination to continue the campaign despite the difficulties they faced. After nearly 10 years of fighting, the Kingdom of Granada finally surrendered in the year 1492. The last Muslim ruler, Boabdil, handed over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. This event marked the end of the Reconquista, which had continued for many centuries. It also fulfilled the goal of bringing the whole of Spain under Christian rule. The capture of Granada was not only an important military success, it also showed the ability of Ferdinand and Isabella to overcome political problems within their kingdoms as well as military challenges from outside. Their success strengthened their authority and played an important part in the creation of a more united Spain. The fall of Granada in the year 1492 became one of the most important events in Spanish history. It represented the complete unification of Spain under Christian rulers. Ferdinand and Isabella now ruled a kingdom that was stronger and more united than before. Their victory changed the future of Spain and influenced events far beyond the borders of their kingdom. Even after Granada was conquered, Ferdinand and Isabella continued to think about new goals. They believed that Spain's future reached beyond the Iberian Peninsula. They wanted their kingdom to become one of the leading powers in the world. To achieve this, they turned their attention to exploration and overseas travel. One man who attracted their attention was Christopher Columbus. For many years, Columbus had asked different European rulers to support his plan to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. He hoped to reach the eastern lands by traveling west instead of following the usual routes. His main goal was to discover a new trade route to Asia. Many rulers rejected his proposal because they doubted that his plan would succeed. Ferdinand and Isabella looked at Columbus's idea differently. They believed that his journey might bring great benefits to Spain. They hoped that a new route to Asia would increase trade, strengthen the kingdom's economy, and raise Spain's importance among the nations of Europe. They also believed that successful exploration could expand Spanish influence into lands that were still unknown to Europeans. After carefully considering his proposal, the Catholic monarchs decided to support Columbus. They provided the ships needed for the voyage, gathered a crew to sail with him, and supplied the money required for the expedition. Their decision would soon become one of the most important choices in the history of Spain and the wider world. In the month of August, in the year 1492, Christopher Columbus left the port of Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and sailed into waters that were still unknown to Europeans. His goal was to find a direct sea route to Asia. Instead, he reached lands that Europeans had not previously explored and that later became known as the New World. On the 12th day of October in the year 1492, Columbus and his crew arrived at islands that are now part of the Bahamas. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia and never understood that he had reached a different part of the world. Even so, his journey encouraged many European countries to explore and later settle in the Americas. The success of Columbus's voyage quickly brought praise and honor to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Spain became one of the leading powers in the world. Soon, Spanish explorers and conquerors crossed the Atlantic Ocean to claim lands for the Spanish crown. Columbus's voyage marked the beginning of Spain's large overseas empire. The results of Columbus's journey reached far beyond Spain. The new lands brought large amounts of wealth through gold, silver, and other valuable resources. At the same time, Spanish settlement led to the takeover of indigenous lands, the forced labor of many native people, and major changes that affected the history of the Americas for many generations. The rulers of Spain quickly understood the value of these newly reached lands. As colonies were established across the Americas, large amounts of precious metals and other resources were sent back to Spain. This brought great wealth to the kingdom and helped its economy grow. During the early years of the 16th century, Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro began famous military expeditions in the Americas. In the year 1519, Cortés arrived in what is now Mexico. With a relatively small force of soldiers and the support of local allies, he defeated the Aztec Empire. He captured large amounts of gold, silver, precious stones, and other valuable treasures from the Aztec capital. During the 1530s, Pizarro led an expedition into the Inca Empire in South America. His forces defeated the empire and took enormous amounts of wealth. The treasures gained from the Aztec and Inca empires greatly increased Spain's riches. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain had become the wealthiest kingdom in Europe. This wealth came with serious human costs. The campaigns of Cortés and Pizarro included battles, violence, and harsh treatment of indigenous people. European diseases, including smallpox, spread through native communities that had little resistance to them. Large numbers of people died, and both the Aztec and Inca empires collapsed, as Spanish rule spread across their lands. As Spain's empire grew, the successors of Ferdinand and Isabella, especially Charles IV, worked to strengthen Spanish control. During his rule, Spain expanded its territories across much of the Caribbean, South America, and parts of North America. Spain became one of the richest and most powerful empires in the world. The wealth arriving from the Americas helped Spain pay for military campaigns across Europe. Spain became an important force in European politics and supported the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation. It also fought wars against rivals such as France, England, and the Ottoman Empire. Despite its riches, Spain also faced growing economic problems. Huge amounts of gold and silver entering the country caused prices to rise. This inflation weakened the economy. Although Spain possessed great wealth, much of it was not invested carefully, making it difficult to maintain long-term financial stability. These problems showed that the empire was not as strong as it appeared. Even with these difficulties, the first years of Spanish expansion brought great expectations. Spain's empire became known for its military strength. These achievements made Spain one of the leading powers of its time. As the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella continued, their plans for Spain became clearer. Their marriage in the year 1469 had united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Together, they built a stronger kingdom under the Catholic faith. The completion of the Reconquista in the year 1492 fulfilled both their political and religious goals. The capture of Granada ended centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Ferdinand and Isabella celebrated this victory as defenders of Christianity and believed it showed God's support for their rule. Their goal was not only to recover land, but also to strengthen Spain as a Catholic kingdom. Soon after the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree in the year 1492. This order required Jewish people living in Spain either to accept Christianity or leave the country. Many thousands chose to leave instead of converting. The decree reflected the ruler's determination to create religious unity throughout Spain according to Catholic beliefs. At the same time, Ferdinand and Isabella continued their efforts to reform the Catholic Church within their kingdom. Their campaign to strengthen religious unity did not end with the activities of the Inquisition, as they continued introducing policies that they believed would protect and reinforce Catholic belief throughout Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was created in the year 1478 and became one of the main ways the rulers enforced the teachings of the Catholic Church. Its goal was to find and punish people accused of heresy, especially Jews who had accepted Christianity but were believed to still practice Judaism in secret. It also targeted Muslims and other people who were not Catholics. The Inquisition became a powerful institution that lasted for many centuries. During that time, many people were investigated, imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Among those who suffered were scholars, Jews, Muslims, and many others accused of going against the teachings of the Catholic Church. Besides carrying out religious changes, Ferdinand and Isabella also worked hard to strengthen Spain's position among the leading kingdoms of Europe. They were not only military rulers, but also skilled diplomats. They built and managed relationships with powerful countries such as France and the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, they worked to protect and expand Spain's influence in the Mediterranean Sea and across the lands in the Americas. Their marriage and their shared rule began a new period in which Spain became more important and influential beyond the Iberian Peninsula. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella died, they had built a strong foundation for Spain to become one of the world's greatest empires. Their goal of creating a politically united and religiously Catholic Spain had largely been achieved. Spain had become a more centralized kingdom with a powerful monarchy, control over many new lands, and a strong Catholic identity. Even after their deaths, their influence continued. Their grandson inherited their large empire and later ruled one of the biggest and most powerful empires in history. The Catholic faith, the riches brought from the Americas, and the political unity created during Ferdinand and Isabella's rule remained important parts of Spain's identity for many centuries. The rule of Ferdinand and Isabella closed one period of Spanish history and opened another. Their marriage and their shared leadership helped prepare Spain for the growth of an empire that would shape events in Europe and the Americas for many years. The story of these Catholic rulers is about careful planning, strong determination, and their effort to build a united Catholic Spain that later became one of the most powerful nations in Europe and the Americas. The year 1492 was an important time not only for Spain, but also for many other parts of the world. After the capture of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista and brought most of Spain under one royal government. Later that same year, another event greatly changed Spain's future. When Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, he reached lands that were unknown to Europeans at that time. His voyage changed the direction of world history. Columbus began his journey because he wanted to find a new sea route to Asia. Instead, he reached lands in the Americas. These lands covered large areas and contained many valuable natural resources. Columbus did not fully understand the importance of what he had found, but his voyage marked the beginning of Spain's efforts to build a large overseas empire. Ferdinand and Isabella quickly understood that these new lands could increase Spain's strength, wealth, and influence. During the years after Columbus's voyage, the Spanish crown continued to expand across the Atlantic Ocean. More expeditions were sent to the Americas, and explorers such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro became important leaders in Spain's expansion. In the year 1519, Cortés led an expedition to the land that is now called Mexico, where he met the powerful Aztec Empire. With a small force, careful planning, and support from local groups, he defeated the Aztec rulers. The wealth taken from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was sent back to Spain and greatly increased the kingdom's riches. At the same time, Francisco Pizarro carried out campaigns in South America. In the year 1533, he defeated the Inca Empire and brought more land under Spanish rule. Spain gained control over large parts of the Americas, and this gave the kingdom access to great amounts of gold, silver, and precious stones. These valuable resources were shipped to Spain, making it one of the richest countries in Europe. Even with these successes, ruling such a large empire was difficult. The long distance between Spain and its American territories made communication slow and government decisions hard to carry out. The Spanish crown had to manage many different lands, stretching from the Caribbean islands to the Pacific coast. Officials had to keep order, collect taxes, protect trade, and maintain control over distant colonies. As Spain continued to expand in the Americas, political events in Europe were also changing. After Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish throne passed to their grandson, Charles I, in the year 1516. He later became known as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. His rule marked the beginning of a new period in Spanish history because Spain's territories now stretched across Europe and the Americas. Charles I was not only the King of Spain. Through inheritance, he also became ruler of many other lands. He inherited the Holy Roman Empire from his family and gained control of territories in Austria, Burgundy, and the Netherlands. This made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. His lands included many different peoples, languages, traditions, and systems of government, making his empire difficult to manage. One of Charles's first tasks was to strengthen his authority within Spain. Although Ferdinand and Isabella had united much of the kingdom, political disagreements still remained, especially in Castile. Many members of the Spanish nobility had become wealthy and influential during the Reconquista. Some were unwilling to fully accept the authority of a king who also ruled many lands outside Spain. Charles spent much of his early reign dealing with these problems and working to strengthen royal authority. At the same time, Charles wanted Spain to play a leading role in European affairs. One of his main goals was to defend the Catholic faith against the growing Protestant movement in Northern Europe, led by Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation questioned the authority of the Pope and changed the religious situation across Europe. Charles strongly supported the Catholic Church and led military campaigns against Protestant forces. In the year 1547 he won the Battle of Mühlberg and defeated an important Protestant army, strengthening Catholic rule in many parts of his empire. Charles also expanded Spanish influence through military campaigns in Italy and North Africa. Spain gained control over important Mediterranean territories, including Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. These possessions strengthened Spain's position around the Mediterranean Sea. Charles also spent many years fighting against France under King Francis I. Both rulers competed for control of territories in Italy and other parts of Europe, leading to a series of long and costly wars. A large part of Charles's strength came from the wealth arriving from Spain's colonies in the Americas. Spanish treasure fleets regularly crossed the Atlantic Ocean carrying large amounts of gold and silver back to Spain. This wealth helped pay for his armies, government, and military campaigns. It also allowed Spain to build a strong navy that protected its trade routes and supported its interests across the seas. The Spanish Armada, which later became one of Spain's most important naval forces, was built with the financial support provided by the riches brought from the Americas. Although Charles I successfully built one of the largest empires in the world, his rule was filled with serious problems. Spain spent huge amounts of money on constant wars, faced religious conflicts, and struggled to govern such a large empire. These difficulties eventually led Charles to make a decision that surprised many people across Europe. In the year 1556, he gave up the throne. He handed the crown of Spain to his son, Philip II, and gave the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand. After Charles gave up the throne in the year 1556, Philip II became King of Spain. His rule marked the period when Spain reached the highest level of its power. This time later became known as the Spanish Golden Age. During these years, Spain had great influence in culture, politics, and the military across Europe and the Americas. Philip inherited an empire that stretched across many parts of the world. Besides ruling Spain and its large colonies in the Americas, he also controlled lands in Italy, the Low Countries, Portugal, and parts of North Africa. His empire was one of the largest ever ruled by a single king. His main goal was to protect Spain's power and increase its influence wherever possible. One of Philip's first challenges was keeping Spain's leading position in Europe. Earlier had started the Protestant Reformation, which divided many Christian countries. Protestant beliefs spread quickly, especially in Northern Europe. Philip was a deeply devoted Catholic and believed it was his duty to defend the Catholic Church. He became one of the main leaders of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and worked hard to stop the spread of Protestant ideas across Europe. His efforts to defend Catholicism brought Spain into conflict with Protestant countries, especially England. The most famous military campaign of his reign took place in the year 1588, when he sent the Spanish Armada to invade England. Philip hoped to remove from the throne and return England to Catholic rule. He sent a huge fleet of ships, but the plan failed. The English navy defeated the Armada after fierce fighting, and storms also caused heavy damage to the Spanish fleet. This defeat weakened Spain's reputation at sea and marked the beginning of a gradual decline in its naval strength. It also changed the balance of power in Europe. Even after the defeat of the Armada, Philip achieved many successes in other areas. Spain continued to grow richer because large amounts of gold and silver arrived from the Americas. Treasure fleets carrying precious metals helped strengthen the royal treasury. This wealth allowed Philip to pay for wars and support his royal court. During Philip's reign, Spain also became a leading center of art, literature, and architecture. Many famous artists lived and worked during this period. Their paintings and other works became some of the finest examples of Spanish art, and many of them received support from the Spanish royal family. The Spanish Inquisition also continued during Philip's rule. It remained a powerful institution that enforced Catholic beliefs and searched for people accused of heresy. Over time, it was also used to silence opposition and control non-Catholic groups living in Spanish lands. Spain continued expanding its territories in the Americas during Philip's reign. Spanish conquistadors followed the paths opened by and exploring and claiming more land in North and South America. Spain controlled Mexico, Peru, and many other large regions. At the same time, Spanish control of the Philippines helped create an important trading connection between Asia and the Americas. Although Spain remained powerful, managing such a huge empire became increasingly difficult. Philip fought many expensive wars, especially in the Netherlands and against the Ottoman Empire. These campaigns used up large amounts of Spain's money and resources. At the same time, the continuous arrival of gold and silver from the Americas caused prices to rise throughout Spain. This inflation slowly weakened the country's economy. By the time Philip died in the year 1598, Spain was still the strongest empire in Europe and the Americas. Its military, religion, and culture remained highly influential. However, economic problems and growing naval difficulties had already begun to weaken the empire. As the 16th century continued, Spain slowly began to show signs of decline. During Philip's reign, Spanish influence had reached its highest point, but keeping such a large empire under control became more difficult every year. The great wealth coming from the Americas made Spain one of the richest countries in Europe, but it also caused rising prices and economic instability. At the same time, Spain's military strength slowly weakened because of internal problems and increasing pressure from foreign enemies. One of the biggest events that weakened Spain's military reputation was the failure of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588. Philip hoped to remove Queen Elizabeth I of England from power. She supported the Dutch rebels fighting against Spain in the Netherlands and encouraged English privateers to attack Spanish treasure ships. Philip planned to send the Armada across the sea, invade England, and restore Catholic rule. The Spanish Armada faced many difficulties from the beginning. Although it was a very large fleet, it was not well organized and could not move as effectively as the smaller English ships. Bad weather also created serious problems. Strong storms scattered many of the Spanish ships before and after the battles. When the Armada finally fought the English navy, it suffered a heavy defeat. Spain lost many experienced sailors and many valuable ships. The defeat of the Armada badly damaged Spain's reputation. Although Spain remained an important naval power, it was no longer the unquestioned ruler of the seas. England became much stronger at sea, and the balance of power in Europe gradually began to change. Spain also faced another major military challenge in the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. The conflict began as a rebellion against Spanish rule and continued for many years. The long war cost Spain enormous amounts of money, exhausted its resources, and caused the loss of many soldiers and territories. By the time Philip II died in the year 1598, Spain had still not defeated the rebellion in the Netherlands. The Dutch had successfully defended their fight for independence, and the Dutch Republic had become one of the important powers in Europe. At the same time, Spain was finding it harder to rule its huge empire. Its land stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, and the great distance between these territories made communication and government slow and difficult. Philip tried to control everything through a central government in Spain, but this often delayed decisions and made the administration less effective. Spain also spent huge amounts of money on wars across Europe and beyond. Although large quantities of gold and silver continued to arrive from the Americas, this wealth did not make the country's economy stronger. Instead, Spain depended too much on these precious metals. As more gold and silver entered the country, prices rose, money lost value, and inflation became a serious problem. Many people found it harder to afford everyday goods, and economic troubles led to growing dissatisfaction among the population. Inside Spain, support for the monarchy also became weaker. Powerful noble families began demanding greater influence, creating tensions between the king and the aristocracy. The Spanish Inquisition continued to punish people who were accused of following beliefs that did not match official Catholic teaching. These harsh actions caused fear and resentment among many people. Heavy taxes, which were collected to pay for Spain's many wars, placed an even greater burden on ordinary families, especially the poor. By the end of Philip's reign, Spain was still one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, but many serious problems had become clear. Military setbacks, political disagreements, and economic weakness were becoming more common. Spain remained an important power in Europe and the Americas, but it was entering a period filled with new political and financial difficulties. By the end of the 16th century, Spain's period of military victories and religious success was beginning to weaken because of growing economic problems. The gold and silver arriving from its colonies in the Americas had once seemed to provide endless wealth, but over time these riches created new difficulties. Spain became too dependent on the steady arrival of precious metals, and this dependence caused rising prices and financial instability. The discovery of lands across the Atlantic had first appeared to promise great wealth. Large amounts of treasure arrived from places such as Mexico and Peru after the conquests led by Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. The Spanish crown used this gold and silver to pay for wars, support the royal court, strengthen the army, and increase the power of the monarchy throughout Europe. However, this great wealth did not create lasting prosperity. Instead of using the money to improve roads, industries, farming, and other parts of the economy, the government continued to depend on treasure from its overseas colonies. This made Spain's economy vulnerable because it relied heavily on resources that came from far away. When less gold and silver reached Spain, the government struggled to continue its spending. Large debts grew, and the economy became weaker. One of the biggest problems was inflation. As increasing amounts of gold and silver entered the country, the value of money fell. The prices of food, clothing, and other goods increased quickly, while workers' wages did not rise at the same speed. Although Spain looked rich from the outside, many economic problems were growing beneath the surface. The cost of constant warfare made these problems even worse. Spain fought long wars in Europe, including the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands and conflicts against the Ottoman Empire. Philip II also spent enormous amounts of money trying to stop the spread of Protestantism. To pay for these campaigns, Spain borrowed large sums of money from foreign bankers. These loans created huge debts that the government could not fully repay. Because of these financial pressures, Spain became even more dependent on the wealth arriving from the Americas. This dependence was dangerous. If less treasure reached Spain, the country's economy would suffer badly. During the later years of the 16th century, this is exactly what happened. Some colonies produced less easily available gold and silver, while resistance to Spanish rule also increased in different regions. At the same time, many members of the Spanish nobility depended on the income from their large estates and colonial trade instead of investing in new industries or improving the country's economy. As a result, economic growth slowed. While countries such as England and the Netherlands expanded trade, developed new industries, and increased commercial activity, Spain failed to keep pace. When Philip II died in the year 1598, Spain was still one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but its economy was under severe pressure because of debt, inflation, and poor financial management. The wealth from the Americas was no longer enough to keep the empire as strong as it had once been. By the later years of the 16th century, Spain's empire was also facing serious challenges, both inside and outside its borders. Although its overseas territories continued to provide valuable resources, its lands in Europe and its military strength were under growing pressure. One of the greatest challenges was the Dutch Revolt, which had begun during the 1660s. The provinces of the Low Countries, which were ruled by Spain, fought to gain their independence. At the same time, Spain's long rivalry with France continued to create instability across Europe. The Dutch Revolt had several causes. Religion was one of the most important. The Protestant Reformation had spread widely throughout the Netherlands. Philip II, who strongly supported the Catholic faith, introduced harsh laws to stop Protestantism. The Spanish Inquisition punished many Protestants, leading to widespread anger. Many people in the Netherlands wanted both religious freedom and greater political freedom, and these demands helped start a rebellion that continued for many years. Economic problems also increased support for the revolt. Spain placed heavy taxes on the Dutch people to pay for its wars and the expenses of the royal court. Many Dutch nobles believed that Philip's central government gave them too little authority and too much control remained in Madrid. They wanted greater independence and the right to manage their own affairs. The revolt became an open war in the year 1568, when several Dutch provinces rose against Spanish rule. During the following years, Spain sent large armies to defeat the rebellion, but the fighting continued. Even with Philip's determined efforts, the Dutch managed to keep control of several important cities, including Antwerp and Amsterdam. They also built a strong resistance movement under the leadership of William the Silent, the Prince of Orange, who became one of the leading figures in the struggle for Dutch independence. By the beginning of the 17th century, Spain's money, soldiers, and other resources were under great pressure. The long war in the Netherlands had cost the country huge amounts of money and many lives. Spain also found it harder to keep control of the region. In the year 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia officially recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. This was a major loss for Spain in northern Europe. After gaining independence, the Dutch Republic became one of the world's leading naval and colonial powers. Dutch merchants and explorers expanded their trade across many parts of the world and became strong competitors to Spain. At the same time, Spain remained involved in long and costly conflicts with France. The French wars of religion and the rivalry between France and Spain over control of parts of Italy kept both countries in frequent conflict. Spain fought many military campaigns to keep control of important territories, such as Milan and Naples. These wars placed a heavy burden on the royal treasury and forced Spain to spread its armies across many battlefields. As France became stronger in both military strength and diplomacy, it slowly reduced Spain's influence in Europe. By the end of the reign of King Philip II, Spain was still the strongest power in southern Europe and controlled a huge empire in the Americas. However, its influence in the Netherlands had greatly weakened, and France had become a much stronger rival. The Dutch Republic had become an independent Protestant nation, and France continued to increase its power. Spain's control over European affairs was becoming weaker. When Philip II died in the year 1598, Spain was still one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. During his rule, the Spanish Golden Age reached its height. Spain won many military victories, collected enormous wealth, strongly supported the Catholic faith, and produced important achievements in art, literature, and learning. The Spanish Empire stretched across the Americas, parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia, giving Spain influence over many regions of the world. Even so, problems were already growing beneath the surface, and these difficulties would slowly lead to the empire's decline. Philip II's successors, especially his son Philip III, inherited an empire that had become harder to rule. Large amounts of gold and silver continued to arrive from the Americas, but the economy depended too heavily on this wealth. Because so much precious metal entered Spain, prices continued to rise, making goods more expensive and creating serious economic problems. Businesses became less productive and the country's financial condition continued to worsen. The economic difficulties that had begun during the reign of Philip II became even more serious under his successors. Spain also began to lose its military advantage. Although its army remained powerful, it could no longer maintain the same level of strength that it had enjoyed during the height of the Spanish Golden Age. The defeat of the Spanish Armada by England in the year 1588 had already shown that Spain no longer ruled the seas as it once had. Spain's resources were stretched across many wars and distant territories, making it difficult to compete with the growing naval and military strength of England, the Dutch Republic, and France. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled Spain for much of the 16th century, also began to face growing problems. Members of the ruling family struggled with internal disagreements and had to manage many difficult alliances with other European rulers. These challenges made it harder for Spain to respond to changing political conditions across Europe. At the same time, Spain's huge empire, with its distant colonies and many different peoples, became much more difficult to govern. The government depended heavily on the power of the nobility and strict central control, making it difficult to encourage new industries, trade, and economic growth that could compete with other European countries. By the beginning of the 17th century, Spain faced many serious challenges. Along with the continuing conflict in the Netherlands and repeated wars with France, unrest also increased in Spain's American colonies. Many indigenous people suffered under harsh labor systems, while heavy taxes placed burdens on colonial communities. These conditions caused growing resistance and occasional rebellions. The Spanish Inquisition also continued its efforts to enforce religious unity. Many people felt threatened by its actions, and its persecution of those with different religious or intellectual beliefs created fear and resentment throughout parts of the empire. Inside Spain, years of warfare and poor management of the colonies weakened the country even further. Trade routes that had once brought great wealth became less profitable as England and the Dutch Republic built their own successful trading networks across the Americas and Asia. These countries increased their influence in world trade, reducing Spain's leading position. Although Spain still ruled a vast empire, its influence in world affairs continued to decline. In the year 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War and officially recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. This agreement confirmed that Spain had lost control of the Netherlands and showed that its political power in Europe had become much weaker than before. Even during this period of decline, the achievements of the Spanish Golden Age continued to have a lasting influence. Artists such as and created works that became some of the greatest masterpieces in European art, wrote books that influenced literature for generations. Spain also left a lasting mark on world exploration, the spread of Catholicism, and the development of many societies in the Americas. During the 17th century, Spain's decline opened the way for new European powers to expand their influence. France, the Dutch Republic, and England became stronger in politics, trade, and military power. These countries increasingly challenged Spain's position in Europe and around the world. By the 18th century, Spain's empire continued to shrink, and many of its colonies in the Americas began to seek independence. As more territories broke away, the long period in which Spain had been the leading global empire gradually came to an end. The Golden Age of Spain is often seen as the time when the country had its greatest cultural, political, and military influence in Europe and the Americas. This period lasted through much of the 16th and 17th centuries. During these years, the Spanish Empire reached its largest size and produced many important works of art, literature, and architecture. Religion, military strength, and cultural growth were important parts of this period and shaped Spain's history for many years. The beginning of Spain's Golden Age is usually linked to the rule of King Philip II, who became king in the year 1556. As the son of Charles V, Philip inherited Spain, its overseas lands, and a large empire that was difficult to govern. During his rule, Spain remained one of the world's leading powers, even though it faced many problems, including the Dutch Revolt and wars with England. Philip ruled as an absolute monarch. He brought more power under the control of the crown and closely managed both Spain and its overseas territories. He was deeply devoted to the Catholic faith, and religion guided many of his decisions. He believed it was his duty to defend Catholicism against the Protestant Reformation, which was spreading across northern Europe. He worked to remove Protestant beliefs from his lands and strongly supported the Catholic Counter-Reformation. During Philip's reign, Spain controlled a huge empire that stretched from the Philippines in the east to the Americas in the west. It also ruled large areas in Italy, the Low Countries, and North Africa. Spain's navy was one of the strongest in the world, and the Spanish Armada played an important role in protecting the empire and supporting its military campaigns. Although not every military campaign ended in success, Philip remained committed to strengthening Spain. Large amounts of gold and silver arrived from Spain's colonies in the Americas. This wealth helped pay for wars and many building projects within Spain. In Madrid, Philip ordered the construction of El Escorial, a large royal palace and monastery that reflected both his authority and his strong religious beliefs. Philip's reign also brought important cultural achievements. Spain became a leading center for art, literature, and architecture. The Spanish Renaissance grew stronger, and artists such as El Greco created works that combined ideas from Spain and Italy. Spanish literature also became more important. In the year 1605, Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote, a book that became one of the greatest works in the Spanish literature and influenced writers across the world. The Habsburg dynasty, represented by Philip II, strengthened the central government of Spain. This system of rule continued under the kings who came after him. Even though Spain faced increasing difficulties during the 17th century, the Golden Age remained a time of great artistic and cultural achievement that is still remembered today. Spain's Golden Age was not only a period of military strength and political influence. It was also a time of major cultural growth under Philip II and the rulers who followed him. Spain became an important center for art, literature, and architecture. Wealth from the American colonies helped the monarchy support artists, writers, and scholars. The country's strong national identity, based on the Catholic faith, the monarchy, and its overseas empire, also encouraged cultural development. One of the greatest achievements of this period was Spanish art. During the reign of Philip II, El Greco became one of Spain's most famous painters. He was born in Greece as Domenikos Theotokopoulos and later moved to Spain during the late 16th century. There he developed his own artistic style. His paintings, including the Burial of the Count of Orgaz and View of Toledo, are known for their long human figures, strong light and shadow, and deep emotional feeling. His work combined Renaissance ideas with a strong religious style that reflected the importance of faith in Spain during this period. Another great Spanish painter was Diego Velázquez, who served as the court painter for King Philip IV. His best-known paintings include Las Meninas and the Surrender of Breda. These works showed life at the royal court as well as ordinary people. Velázquez became known for his skill in using light, shadow, and careful composition. His paintings, especially his portraits of the royal family, nobles, and common people, became famous for their realistic style and influenced many later artists. Spanish literature also reached a high point during the Golden Age. Miguel de Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, which was published in the year 1605. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest books ever written. The story follows Don Quixote, a man who believes he is a knight, and his loyal companion, Sancho Panza. The novel explores ideas about dreams, reality, personal identity, and changes in society. It also played an important role in the development of the modern novel. The theatre also became very popular during this period. Playwrights such as Lope de Vega and Tirso de Molina wrote plays that explored the lives, beliefs, and struggles of people in Spanish society. Lope de Vega wrote hundreds of plays during the 16th and 17th centuries. His comedies and tragedies became well known for their strong emotions, dramatic stories, and interesting characters. Tirso de Molina is remembered for creating the famous character Don Juan, whose actions and moral choices became important subjects in Spanish literature and drama. Architecture also developed greatly during Spain's Golden Age. One of the most important buildings of the period was El Escorial, the royal palace and monastery ordered by Philip II near Madrid. It was designed by Juan de Herrera. The building reflected Philip's authority and his deep Catholic faith. Its simple classical design matched the king's wish for a religious setting. El Escorial included a monastery, a royal palace, and a library, and it served as an important religious and royal centre. During the 17th century, the Baroque style of architecture became popular in Spain. It was known for its large, detailed, and emotional designs. Many churches, palaces, and public buildings were built in this style to show the greatness of Spain during its Golden Age. Spain's Golden Age was not only a time of political and military success, it was also a time of great achievements in art, literature, and architecture. Artists, writers, and architects created works that reflected Spanish identity, which was strongly influenced by the Catholic faith, the Habsburg monarchy, and the large empire ruled by Spain. These cultural achievements are still admired today and continue to influence art and literature around the world. Religion was one of the most important parts of Spain's Golden Age. It shaped the country's culture, government, and national identity. Catholicism was seen as the foundation of Spain's unity and the purpose of its empire. Under the Habsburg rulers, the Spanish monarchy strongly defended the Catholic faith. They became leading supporters of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and worked hard to stop the spread of Protestantism in Spain and throughout their territories. One of the most important tools used to control religion during this time was the Spanish Inquisition. It had been established by Ferdinand and Isabella in the year 1478. It was first created to protect Catholic beliefs by finding and punishing people accused of heresy. During the rule of Philip II and the kings who followed him, the Inquisition became both a religious and political institution. It mainly investigated Protestants, Jews and Muslims who were believed to have secretly become Christians, or who continued to follow their old religions in private. Although the power of the Inquisition slowly became weaker during the later years of Spain's Golden Age, it continued to affect Spanish society. It watched converts from Judaism, known as conversos, and converts from Islam, known as moriscos, as well as anyone suspected of going against Catholic teachings. Torture and public executions were used in some cases, creating fear and encouraging people to obey religious rules. The Spanish monarchy believed the Inquisition was necessary to keep the country united and to prevent Protestant ideas from spreading. Religious faith was closely connected to Spain's national identity. Philip II was deeply devoted to Catholic teaching and believed that the Habsburg family had been chosen by God to defend the Catholic Church. His wars against Protestant countries, including the attempt to invade England with the Spanish Armada in the year 1588, were driven by both political goals and the desire to restore Catholicism in Protestant lands. During his rule, Europe experienced many conflicts between Catholic and Protestant powers, and Spain became the strongest supporter of the Pope. Catholic beliefs could also be seen in Spain's buildings, paintings and schools. The Church played an important part in everyday life, and religion strongly influenced Spanish art. Religious paintings by El Greco and portraits of the royal family by Velázquez often included religious ideas, showing the strong influence of Catholicism in the royal court and throughout society. Spain's religious commitment also reached the Americas. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries traveled to the newly discovered lands to spread Christianity and convert indigenous peoples. These missions became an important part of building Spain's empire. Religious groups played a major role in introducing Spanish culture and Catholic beliefs to local communities. Spain believed it had a duty given by God to spread the Catholic faith throughout the world, and this belief encouraged the growth of its empire. At the same time, Spain's strict religious policies created problems. The expulsion of the Jews in the year 1492 and the forced conversion of Muslims during the early 16th century reduced the country's cultural and economic diversity. Many Jews and Muslims had made valuable contributions to learning, science, trade, and business. Their removal or forced conversion weakened Spanish society. The Moriscos remained a source of conflict because many secretly continued to practice Islam after being forced to become Christians. This led to suspicion and repeated expulsions. Even with these difficulties, Catholicism remained a powerful force that united Spain during the Golden Age. It strengthened Spain's position as the leading Catholic kingdom in Europe, with the Habsburg monarchy acting as its strongest defender. As Spain expanded across the Americas and into Asia, Catholicism was used to justify imperial expansion by presenting it as a mission to spread the Christian faith and save souls. The belief that the king ruled by God's authority was closely connected to the idea that Spain had been chosen to defend and spread Catholicism. Many people believed that the success of Spain's empire came from God's blessing. Spain's Golden Age was also a time of great economic strength. Because of the riches brought from the Americas, Spain became the wealthiest and most powerful country in Europe during the 16th century. The Spanish Empire ruled large territories around the world, and the wealth from its colonies, especially in Mexico and Peru, paid for military campaigns, supported the royal court, and encouraged artistic and cultural activities. The greatest source of Spain's wealth came from fleets of ships that carried gold and silver from the Americas back to Spain. The colonies in Mexico and Peru were rich in precious metals, and these resources were transported through carefully organized royal fleets. This wealth increased Spain's influence across Europe, paid for its wars, and helped support the Catholic counter-reformation under Philip II and the rulers who came after him. Although this wealth made Spain very powerful, it also created serious economic problems. Spain depended too much on gold and silver from the Americas instead of developing other parts of its economy. The large amount of precious metals entering the country caused inflation, reducing the value of money and making prices rise. Spain seemed very rich, but its economy relied heavily on a steady supply of treasure from its colonies. If that supply changed, the country's economy suffered. Much of the wealth was also not invested in local industries, causing Spain to fall behind other European countries in economic development and new ideas. Even with these weaknesses, Spain's wealth allowed it to dominate international trade. Its navy was one of the largest and strongest in the world and helped protect trade routes across the Americas. This gave Spain control over huge amounts of gold and silver, which were among the most important resources in the world economy during the Age of Exploration. The Spanish crown used this wealth to finance wars, increase its influence in Europe, and strengthen its empire. A large share of the money from Spain's colonies was spent on military expansion. Spain maintained a strong army and navy that helped protect its empire and gave it control over much of the Mediterranean Sea. Military campaigns in Italy, the Netherlands, and against the Ottoman Empire were largely paid for with the wealth that arrived from the Americas. Spain's attempt to invade England with the Spanish Armada in the year 1588 showed the country's strong military goals, but the campaign ended in a costly defeat. Even after this failure, Spain remained an important military power throughout much of the 17th century. The wealth brought from the Americas helped Spain keep its political influence across Europe. Its position in the Holy Roman Empire, its control of much of Italy, and its role in the 30 Years' War were all supported by its great economic resources, powerful army, and royal marriage alliances. Spain continued to influence European politics throughout much of the 16th and 17th centuries. The riches arriving from the Americas also helped Spain become a leading nation in global exploration and trade. The Philippine Islands, named after Philip II, became an important trading center connecting Asia with the Americas. Spanish merchants created profitable trade routes that linked the Americas with East Asia through the Philippines. They transported valuable goods such as silk, spices, and Chinese products back to Spain. This trading network expanded Spain's worldwide influence because its empire stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, making Spain an important part of the early global economy. Although the wealth from the Americas gave Spain great power, it also revealed problems that would affect the empire in the years ahead. Large amounts of gold and silver caused prices to rise, creating inflation. Spain invested too little in its own industries and depended heavily on precious metals to pay for wars and political expansion. These problems gradually weakened the empire. During its golden age, however, Spain enjoyed great wealth and influence, allowing it to play a leading role in world politics and the global economy for many generations. Spain's golden age was not only a time of cultural and economic success, it was also a period of great military strength. Its army and navy helped secure Spain's position as one of Europe's leading powers under Philip II and the rulers who followed him. Spanish military power reached from the Mediterranean Sea to the Americas, and the country took part in many wars that shaped the history of Europe and other parts of the world. One of the greatest strengths of Spain during the Golden Age was its navy. Spanish fleets controlled important sea routes connecting Europe, the Americas, and Asia. The Spanish Armada, created during the late 16th century, became a symbol of Spain's naval power. Although it was defeated by England in the year 1588, Spain continued to maintain a strong navy throughout much of the Golden Age. Its fleets remained especially active in the Mediterranean, where they fought against the Ottoman Empire and defended Spain's lands in Italy and North Africa. Spain's military strength was not limited to the sea. The Spanish tercios, an elite infantry force, played a major role in Spain's victories during the 16th century. These heavily armed soldiers fought successfully in many land battles across Europe. They were especially important in the Low Countries, where Spain tried to stop the Dutch revolt, and during the 30 Years' War. The tercios became famous for their discipline, courage, and effective battlefield tactics, making them one of the most respected military forces in Europe. By the middle of the 17th century, Spain's military power was beginning to weaken. The 30 Years' War, fought from the year 1618 to the year 1648, was mainly a struggle between Catholic and Protestant states in Europe. Spain joined the Catholic League under the rule of the Habsburg dynasty. It hoped to keep its influence in Germany and the Low Countries while defending the Catholic faith. As the war continued, Spain's military strength slowly declined. The long conflict exhausted the country's soldiers and finances, reducing the effectiveness of its army. The war was especially damaging in the Low Countries, where the Dutch had already been fighting against Spanish rule since the year 1568. Spain also had to fight on several fronts, including France and the Holy Roman Empire. It faced many enemies including France, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic. Fighting so many wars at the same time placed enormous pressure on Spain's military resources. The Treaty of Westphalia, signed in the year 1648, ended the 30 Years' War and marked an important stage in Spain's decline. Spain had to give up several important territories, including parts of the Spanish Netherlands, and its leading position in Europe became weaker. The military defeats, together with financial and political problems, marked the beginning of Spain's decline as one of Europe's strongest military powers. Another reason for Spain's military decline was its growing dependence on hired soldiers and members of the noble class. The famous tercios had once been the foundation of Spain's army, but the quality of soldiers gradually declined. Inflation and economic problems also reduced the strength of the armed forces. Many nobles who were given command of armies lacked the training and discipline needed to lead soldiers successfully. By the late 17th century, Spain was no longer the military power it had once been. Its armies suffered defeats in many places, and its control of the seas was challenged by England, the Netherlands, and later France. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from the year 1701 to the year 1714, further weakened Spain. The country was forced to give up several important territories to France and Britain. Even though Spain's military strength declined, the achievements of its golden age continued to be remembered. The Spanish tercios remained known as some of the best trained soldiers in Europe, and the Spanish Navy continued to support global trade and exploration. Spain's military influence became smaller, but many of its political and cultural institutions continued to exist for centuries. By the 17th century, Spain's golden age was beginning to fade. Although large amounts of wealth continued to arrive from the Americas, the empire faced growing problems both inside and outside its borders. The Habsburg dynasty, which had raised Spain to great power, struggled to keep control of its vast territories. The empire still had a strong military and enormous wealth, but maintaining such a large empire placed increasing pressure on Spain's economy and armed forces. One of the biggest reasons for Spain's decline was financial weakness. The constant arrival of gold and silver from the Americas had first made Spain very rich, but over time it caused serious inflation. The large supply of precious metals reduced the value of Spanish money, making goods and services more expensive. As prices continued to rise, the buying power of ordinary people became weaker. Spain also became too dependent on wealth from the Americas. Instead of investing in industries at home, it continued to use gold and silver to pay for wars and the expensive lifestyle of the royal court. Because of this, Spain did not build a stronger and more balanced economy. Its slow industrial development made it difficult to compete with countries such as England, the Netherlands and France, which were expanding their trade and industries. Spain's military, which had once been the foundation of its power, also became weaker. Although the Spanish Armada had enjoyed early successes, Spain's armed forces gradually lost strength because the empire had become too large and resources were running short. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from the year 1618 to the year 1648, used up much of Spain's wealth and made it harder to control its territories. Spain spent huge amounts of money on military campaigns across Europe, especially in the Netherlands, where the Dutch revolt had already weakened Spanish rule. The Treaty of Westphalia, signed in the year 1648, officially ended the conflict and recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic. This was a major loss for Spain and greatly reduced its power in Europe. At the same time, Spain's empire in the Americas was facing many problems. The continuous exploitation of indigenous people, together with the gradual exhaustion of the gold and silver mines that were easiest to reach, caused the colonial economy to slow down. Resistance to Spanish rule became stronger in many places, and the great distance between Spain and its colonies made it difficult for the government to keep full control. Although Spain still ruled large parts of the Americas, the economic and political difficulties of governing such a large empire slowly weakened its strength. Another serious setback came during the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from the year 1701 to the year 1714. This war was fought over who would become the ruler of Spain. It involved Spain and a group of European countries that included France, Britain, and the Dutch Republic. The fighting ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in the year 1713, which greatly reduced Spain's lands in Europe. Spain was forced to give Gibraltar to Britain, giving Britain an important position in the Mediterranean Sea. Spain also lost the Spanish Netherlands, Naples and Milan to other European powers. These losses ended Spain's position as the leading power in Europe and began a period in which other countries became more influential in European politics. Within Spain, political problems were also becoming more serious. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled the country for many centuries, faced repeated disputes over who should inherit the throne, and the authority of the monarchy became weaker. The later Habsburg kings were often unable to rule effectively or keep the same level of authority as the earlier rulers. Because of this weak leadership, political unrest increased, and the noble class gained more power, making it even harder for the monarchy to control the empire. By the beginning of the 18th century, Spain still possessed a large empire, but it was no longer the strongest power it had been during its golden age. Its influence in Europe had become much smaller, and its economy had been badly weakened by inflation, heavy dependence on wealth from the Americas, and repeated military defeats. The decline of Spain's empire marked the end of the Habsburg period and the beginning of a new stage in the country's history. The Bourbon family came to the throne and tried to reform Spain as Europe entered a new political era. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire, which had once been the most powerful empire in the world, was beginning to lose its strength. The enormous wealth that came from its colonies in the Americas had made many people believe that Spain's power would never fade. However, beneath this appearance of strength, the country was facing serious economic and political problems that would shape its future throughout the 17th century. One of the greatest problems was the heavy dependence on gold and silver brought from the Americas. Throughout much of the 16th century, these valuable metals flowed steadily into Spain. They paid for military campaigns, supported the royal court, and provided money for the Catholic Church. By the beginning of the 17th century, however, depending too much on these resources began to create new difficulties. The constant arrival of gold and silver caused inflation, because the large supply of precious metals reduced the value of Spanish money. As prices continued to rise, ordinary people found that their money could buy less than before, and this weakened the economy. At the same time, Spain depended so much on the wealth of its colonies that it failed to build a strong and varied economy at home. Other European countries, including England and the Netherlands, were quickly expanding their industries, trade systems, and financial institutions. Spain, however, did not invest enough in roads, ports, factories, or farming. As a result, the country's economy grew very slowly. Important industries such as textile production and shipbuilding could no longer compete with those of its rivals. Much of the wealth from the Americas was spent on wars and the expensive lifestyle of the royal family instead of being invested in improving Spain's economy. This placed even greater pressure on the country's finances. The Habsburg monarchy, which had been the main source of Spain's power for many years, was also becoming weaker. The system of strong central rule had worked well during Spain's golden age, but it was becoming less effective. The royal government that managed Spain's huge empire became more corrupt and less efficient. Members of the noble class also became more powerful. They gained greater control over local affairs and slowly weakened the authority of the king. Spain's military also began to lose its former strength. The famous Spanish tercios, the highly trained infantry units that had helped Spain win many battles, now suffered from poor leadership and a shortage of money and supplies. The long and expensive 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, placed even greater pressure on Spain's military and economy. The conflict was mainly fought over religious and political disputes in Central Europe. Spain spent large amounts of money and soldiers fighting Protestant countries. Although Spain won several battles in the early years, the war continued for so long that it exhausted the country's strength and prevented it from deciding the final result of the conflict. Spain's naval power had already suffered a major setback after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588. Spain still had a large fleet, but it no longer ruled the seas as it once had. England and the Dutch Republic became stronger naval powers, making it harder for Spain to protect its trade routes and overseas territories. Spain's army also faced many problems. Soldiers often received poor training, military tactics became outdated, and there was not enough money to properly support the armed forces. These problems made it increasingly difficult for Spain to maintain its military influence in Europe and the Americas. As the economy weakened and military problems increased, the Habsburg rulers gradually lost their firm control over Spain. The political system, which had depended on a powerful king and a strong royal court, had served the country well during the Golden Age. By the beginning of the 17th century, however, it could no longer respond effectively to the fast-changing conditions across Europe. Financial troubles, political instability, and repeated military failures became common during this period and marked the beginning of a long decline that continued throughout the 17th century. One of the most important events that contributed to the weakening of the Spanish Empire during the 17th century was the Dutch Revolt. The conflict had started in the late 16th century, but it continued to reduce Spain's control over the Low Countries throughout the 17th century. The revolt was caused by a mixture of religious, political, and economic problems. It became an important struggle between the Catholic rulers of Spain and the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. The Spanish Netherlands, which today include Belgium and Luxembourg, had long been an important part of Spain's empire. During the 16th century, the region was wealthy and made valuable contributions to Spain through trade, textile production, and other industries. As Protestant beliefs spread across northern Europe, including the Netherlands, tensions between the Catholic government in Madrid and the growing Protestant population increased. These disagreements eventually became impossible to control. The revolt began in the year 1568 under the leadership of William the Silent, the Prince of Orange. The conflict became even stronger because of the strict religious policies of King Philip II, who wanted to stop the spread of the Protestant Reformation throughout his territories. In response to Philip's use of the Inquisition, many people in the Netherlands rose against Spanish rule, and the uprising soon developed into a long and destructive war. Although Spain won several battles during the early years of the conflict, the war continued for many decades. Spain's military was already fighting on several fronts, including the 30 Years' War, making it difficult to send enough soldiers and supplies to the Netherlands. The Dutch remained determined to gain their independence. They also received support from Protestant countries across Europe, especially England, and from the Dutch East India Company. With this support, they were able to continue resisting Spanish rule. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic, led by the United Provinces of the Netherlands, had become one of Spain's strongest enemies. The Dutch navy was among the most advanced in Europe and played a major role in the conflict. Spanish naval forces, which had once dominated the seas, found it increasingly difficult to match the growing strength and skill of the Dutch fleet. After many years of war, Spain and the Dutch rebels signed the 12 Years' Truce in the year 1609. The fighting stopped for a time, giving the Dutch a chance to recover and strengthen their position. However, the war began again after the truce ended. In the year 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia officially recognized the Dutch Republic as an independent country. Spain had effectively lost control of the Spanish Netherlands, and this was a serious political and economic defeat in Europe. Losing the Spanish Netherlands had major effects on Spain. It lost one of its richest territories, which had provided large amounts of wealth through trade and taxes. Spain's military position in Europe also became weaker. At the same time, the Dutch became stronger in trade and warfare. After gaining independence, the Netherlands entered its Dutch Golden Age. Its trade, shipping, and economy expanded quickly, making it one of Europe's leading sea and trading powers. As the Dutch grew stronger, Spain's influence in Europe and around the world continued to decline. Spain's failure to defeat the Dutch revolt also showed that its military power had limits. Even though the Spanish tercios and its well-equipped armies were still respected, Spain could no longer keep control of the Low Countries, which had once been completely under Spanish rule. Losing the Spanish Netherlands marked the beginning of Spain's slow withdrawal from its position as the leading power in Europe. The defeat showed that the Spanish Empire could no longer hold together its huge European territories. The loss of the Netherlands also badly damaged Spain's economy. The Dutch had made important contributions to Spain's wealth through trade and taxes. Once they became independent, many valuable trade connections were broken. Instead of building strong industries and agriculture at home, Spain depended heavily on gold and silver brought from the Americas. This made the empire's financial problems even worse. During the early 17th century, Spain faced growing economic problems that greatly increased its decline. At first, the huge amounts of gold and silver arriving from the Americas made Spain the richest country in Europe. However, by the 17th century, this wealth created serious economic problems. The large supply of precious metals caused inflation. Money lost value, and the prices of food, clothing, and other everyday goods rose sharply. Although Spain appeared to be rich, its economy was moving toward financial collapse. The main reason for Spain's economic problems was its heavy dependence on wealth from the Americas. The treasure brought from the colonies was not invested in local industries or farming. Instead of creating a strong and lasting economy, the money was spent on luxury, government expenses, and costly wars. Spain used much of its wealth to support large armies across Europe and its overseas territories. It fought long wars in the Netherlands, Italy, North Africa, and against France. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from the year 1618 to the year 1648, placed even greater pressure on Spain's finances. The long conflict left the country with huge debts and a financial system that could no longer support its ambitions. The cost of these wars was enormous. Spain borrowed large amounts of money from foreign banks to pay for its military campaigns. As the wars against the Dutch and the French continued, the government found it harder to repay these loans or even pay the interest. Spain repeatedly failed to meet its financial obligations, causing foreign lenders to lose confidence in the country. In the year 1627, Spain declared bankruptcy once again, making its financial position even weaker. Inflation continued to create serious problems. As more gold and silver entered Spain, their value fell, causing prices to rise across the economy. Workers' wages did not increase enough to match the higher cost of living. Many ordinary people struggled to buy food and other basic needs, and the economy slowed down. Many wealthy nobles enjoyed the riches coming from the colonies, but refused to pay taxes or invest in businesses and industries that could have helped the country recover. This made the economic crisis even worse. Spain also suffered from slow economic growth. While countries such as England and the Netherlands were developing industries, expanding manufacturing, increasing trade, and building stronger navies, Spain remained dependent mainly on farming and mining. Because it failed to develop industries, Spain could not keep up with the changing world economy. As England and the Dutch Republic expanded their trade networks and colonial empires, Spain became less competitive in international markets. The empire also depended too much on foreign trade. Although Spain ruled vast lands in the Americas, it failed to build a strong economy at home. Instead of encouraging Spanish factories and exports, much of the wealth from the colonies was spent on expensive imported goods and continuous wars. Because Spain did not develop different parts of its economy, it became more vulnerable whenever international trade changed, making its economy weaker over time. The noble class made these problems even more difficult to solve. Most nobles paid very little tax and became increasingly wealthy through their large estates. Many had little interest in improving Spain's economy or supporting reforms. Their control over land and government finances prevented important changes that could have helped modernize the country. As Spain's economic difficulties grew, social unrest also increased. Farmers, workers, and poor people in the towns suffered from high taxes, rising prices, and growing poverty. Meanwhile, many nobles were protected from these hardships because of their wealth and special privileges. The government also managed its finances poorly, making the situation even worse. The empire became less efficient, and the system that had once helped Spain become one of the world's greatest powers was now contributing to its steady decline. As Spain's empire began to weaken in the early 17th century, one of the main reasons for its decline was political instability and poor leadership by its rulers. During Spain's Golden Age, the country was ruled by an absolute monarchy, and kings such as Philip II held great power. However, the later Habsburg kings were not able to keep the same level of control over the empire. Their rule was marked by weak leadership, problems over succession, and the growing power of the nobility, which reduced the authority of the monarchy. The Habsburg dynasty faced many internal problems after the rule of Philip II. His successors, especially Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II, were either ineffective or unable to manage Spain's huge empire. Philip III ruled from the year 1598 to the year 1621. He spent little time managing the kingdom himself and handed most government duties to his favourite advisor, the Duke of Lerma. This led to corruption and poor government. The Duke of Lerma rewarded his supporters with important positions and failed to run the country efficiently. Many leading people in Spain became unhappy, and the empire was governed poorly. Philip IV ruled from the year 1621 to the year 1665. Although he took a greater interest in government than his father, his reign was still filled with political problems. He depended heavily on advisors, especially the Count Duke of Olivares. Olivares wanted to reform Spain and strengthen the power of the king. However, his policies often brought him into conflict with the nobility and with regions such as Catalonia and Aragon. His efforts to increase taxes and strengthen royal control to pay for Spain's military campaigns caused widespread anger and resistance. Political instability became even worse because of problems over succession. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, came from a royal family that had been weakened by generations of marriage between close relatives. Throughout his life, he suffered from many serious health problems. He ruled from the year 1665 to the year 1700. During his reign, the empire fell into disorder. Charles II was unable to produce an heir, and his poor physical and mental health made it difficult for him to rule effectively. When he died without a clear successor, many European countries competed for control of the Spanish throne. This led to the War of the Spanish Succession. The growing influence of the nobility also added to Spain's political problems. During the 16th century and the early 17th century, Spanish nobles enjoyed many special privileges. They paid very few taxes and controlled large estates and private military forces. As Spain's economy became weaker and its military power declined, many nobles focused on protecting their own interests instead of supporting the king. They began to rule their own lands with greater independence. At the same time, regional identity became stronger, especially in places such as Catalonia and Aragon, where people demanded more self-government and resisted the authority of the crown. The weakening of the central government was also clear in Spain's overseas empire. The great distance between Spain and its colonies in the Americas made it difficult for the king to govern them effectively. Local governors, military commanders, and viceroys often made important decisions on their own, reducing the control of the monarchy. Spain also depended heavily on military and religious organizations in the colonies, making government less organized. Many colonial officials cared more about their own wealth and power than about serving the Spanish crown. For example, the Jesuits built powerful missions across South America, and in many places their influence became greater than that of Spanish government officials. Inside Spain, the government's administrative system also became weaker. Corruption became common, and many officials gained their positions because of family connections or bribery instead of ability. Spain's financial system was poorly managed. The government often failed to repay its debts and lacked proper control over spending. Because there was no strong and efficient civil service, it became harder to govern Spain's distant territories. The failure to improve the administration made the country's political problems even worse. By the middle of the 17th century, Spain's empire, which stretched across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, was beginning to fall apart because of internal weakness and outside pressures. Although Spain had once established strong control over large parts of the Americas, its declining political and military strength led to revolts, rebellions, and the loss of territories. These events marked the beginning of the empire's long decline. One of the main reasons for Spain's weakening position in the Americas was the growing resistance of indigenous peoples and colonial subjects. For many years, Spain had controlled native communities and forced many of them to work in mines and plantations that produced valuable resources such as gold, silver, and sugar. At the same time, the Spanish Inquisition, forced conversion to Catholicism, harsh working conditions, and the spread of European diseases created deep anger among many indigenous communities. In the Andes and Mesoamerica, indigenous uprisings became more common during this period. One of the best-known examples was the Pueblo Revolt in the year 1680 in what is now New Mexico. During this uprising, the Pueblo people successfully drove the Spanish out of their homeland for more than 10 years. This was one of the few major victories won by indigenous people against Spanish colonial rule. Although it happened after the middle of the 17th century, it showed the growing unrest that existed throughout Spain's colonies. While indigenous communities fought to regain their freedom, the Spanish government also faced serious economic problems in the colonies. Silver mining in places such as Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, had reached its highest levels and then began to decline. The easiest gold and silver deposits had already been exhausted. Poor government, corruption among colonial officials, and increasing problems in trade and mining slowed economic growth. As a result, many parts of Spain's colonial economy became stagnant, making it even harder for the empire to maintain its power. By the early 17th century, piracy had become a major problem for Spain. English, Dutch, and French ships often attacked Spanish treasure fleets and captured the gold, silver, and other valuable goods being brought from the Americas. Pirates and privateers, such as Sir Francis Drake, also attacked Spanish ships and raided Spanish towns and settlements. These attacks made it harder for Spain to protect its colonies. The loss of valuable treasure, together with Spain's own political and economic problems, reduced the empire's wealth and strength. Spain's loss of control over the Spanish Netherlands earlier in the century was followed by other uprisings in different parts of the empire. One important example was the Catalonian Revolt in the year 1640. Many people in Catalonia rose against Spanish rule because they wanted greater self-government. They were unhappy with heavy economic demands and the Spanish monarchy's efforts to increase its control over the region. During the revolt, France gained temporary control of Catalonia. Spain later recovered most of the region under the Treaty of the Pyrenees in the year 1659. Even so, the revolt showed that many parts of the empire were becoming dissatisfied with Spanish rule. In Mexico, the Mixton Revolt during the 1540s, along with smaller uprisings in the Andes, also showed growing resistance to Spanish rule. Spain had first gained control of these lands through military conquest and the spread of Christianity. By the early 17th century, however, it was becoming more difficult to govern territories that were so far from Spain. Wealthy local leaders and noble families in the Americas often resisted the authority of the Spanish king, making it harder for the government to control its large overseas empire. The Spanish government also struggled to create strong central control over its colonies. Viceroys and local officials sometimes worked for their own benefit instead of serving the interests of the empire. Spain also invested too little in roads, ports, public buildings, and other important infrastructure in the colonies. At the same time, it became more difficult to maintain order and loyalty across the Americas. These problems slowly weakened Spain's control over its overseas territories. Although Spain continued to rule most of Latin America for many more years, the first signs of future independence were already beginning to appear during this period. Spain was no longer the only great power in the Americas. Local groups became stronger, and foreign rivals continued to challenge Spanish authority. England, France, and the Netherlands expanded their own empires and built stronger navies, allowing them to compete with Spain in trade and colonial affairs. Their growing influence reduced Spain's position in the world economy and helped create the conditions that later led to revolutions and the independence movements that spread across the Spanish-speaking world during the 19th century. By the late 16th century, Spain had become the strongest naval power in Europe. During the rule of King Philip II, Spain's strength at sea became one of the main foundations of its worldwide empire. The great wealth arriving from the Americas allowed Spain to build a huge navy that later became known as the Spanish Armada. This fleet represented Spain's military strength and its commitment to the Catholic faith. It was built to protect Spain's lands across Europe, defend its colonies, keep its trade routes safe, and resist the growing influence of Protestant countries. At that time, Spain ruled large territories in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Because its empire stretched across many parts of the world, the Spanish Navy played an important role in protecting Spain's trade, defending its overseas possessions, and keeping rival nations away. Philip II was a devoted Catholic who believed that his navy was not only a way to protect Spain's lands, but also an important weapon in the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Earlier in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation had divided Europe. England, under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, had become a firmly Protestant kingdom. The spread of Protestantism, especially in England and the Netherlands, challenged both the authority of the Catholic Church and the power of Spain. During the 1570s and 1580s, Spain expanded and strengthened its navy as it prepared for a possible war with England. By then, England was supporting the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. It also gave support to privateers such as Sir Francis Drake, who attacked Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean. England's involvement in these conflicts, together with Queen Elizabeth's support for Protestant movements, made England a major enemy of Philip II. A military conflict between the two countries became increasingly likely. Philip II's plan led to the creation of the Spanish Armada, a huge fleet of more than 130 ships. It included large galleons, frigates and support vessels, together with an army of about 30,000 men. The main purpose of the Armada was to invade England, remove Queen Elizabeth I from power, and restore Catholicism to the country. Philip believed that this mission was both a military campaign and a religious duty. He believed he was carrying out God's will by ending Protestant rule in England. To succeed, the Armada needed to sail across the English Channel, defeat the English navy, and land its soldiers on the English coast. Spain had built its naval strength over many years through military victories and expansion. Now its navy faced its greatest challenge. The Spanish fleet also faced many difficulties. Many of its ships were large, heavily armed, and slower than the English ships. The changing weather and dangerous conditions of the English Channel created even greater problems and would play an important part in the coming battle. At this time, Spain's naval power had reached its highest point. However, it was about to face a conflict that would change the history of Europe and begin Spain's slow decline as the leading European power. The battle between the Spanish Armada and the English fleet in the year 1588 became one of the most important events in the struggle for power in Europe. The future of both Catholic and Protestant Europe depended greatly on its outcome. In the late 1580s, Philip II decided to gather a great fleet that would attack England. The Spanish Armada, known as the Great and Most Fortunate Fleet, was created not only to invade England, but also to bring Catholicism back to a country that had accepted Protestantism under Queen Elizabeth I. Building the Armada required many years of planning and enormous amounts of money, much of it coming from Spain's colonies in the Americas and from its military bases across Europe and the Americas. Philip II's plan was simple. He wanted to build the largest naval fleet ever assembled, sail from Spain, defeat the English navy, and land a large army in England. Spanish soldiers, together with forces from the Catholic Netherlands, which was under Spanish rule, would then march to London, remove Queen Elizabeth from power, and restore Catholic rule. Philip believed this would be both a military victory and a religious campaign that would stop the spread of Protestantism in Europe. The invasion plan depended on several actions taking place successfully. Spain gathered a fleet of more than 130 ships, including large galleons, frigates, and support vessels. About 30,000 soldiers and 7,000 sailors were assigned to the mission. This powerful force was intended to defeat the English navy and make it possible for Spanish troops to invade England. The fleet was assembled in Lisbon, Portugal. From there, it was expected to meet the army of the Duke of Parma, who was stationed in the Spanish Netherlands. After joining together, the combined forces would sail to England and begin their campaign to restore Catholicism. Spain's strategy depended on close cooperation between its navy and its army. The Duke of Parma, who commanded the Spanish forces in the Netherlands, was expected to move his army across the English Channel after the Armada had defeated the English fleet. His soldiers would then land in England and march toward London. This combined attack by sea and land was expected to defeat the English quickly. The Spanish Armada planned to sail in a tightly organized formation so that the ships could support one another and use their firepower together. The fleet would move through the English Channel, defeat the smaller English fleet, and protect the soldiers who were to land in England. Although the Armada's great size and strength were its main advantages, they also created serious problems. The large fleet moved slowly and was difficult to control. Spanish commanders also had to guide their ships through the narrow and unfamiliar waters of the English Channel, where changing weather and strong winds made sailing even more difficult. Spain's entire plan depended on the belief that the English navy could be defeated in a direct battle. Spain's navy was much larger than England's, but the English had an important advantage. The English ships were smaller, faster, and much easier to turn during battle. The English fleet was led by Admiral Lord Howard of Effingham, while one of its most famous commanders was Sir Francis Drake. Drake had spent many years attacking Spanish treasure ships and was well known for his bold and clever fighting methods. Although the Spanish ships were huge and carried great firepower, they were slow and difficult to move. This weakness would become one of the main reasons for Spain's defeat. Spain carefully planned the invasion, but it failed to give enough attention to one powerful enemy: the weather. The English Channel was famous for its sudden storms, strong winds, and thick fog, which often made sailing dangerous. When the Spanish fleet left Lisbon it soon faced these harsh conditions. The bad weather would play a major role in the events that followed. Although the Spanish Armada looked stronger on paper, victory was far from certain. Queen Elizabeth I ordered the English navy to avoid close combat whenever possible. Instead, the English ships would quickly attack the slower Spanish vessels, fire their cannons, and then sail away before the Spanish could strike back. English sailors were highly skilled and well trained for this kind of naval warfare. Every ship and every battle plan had been carefully prepared. King Philip II believed that the Armada would easily defeat England, overthrow Protestant rule, and restore the Catholic faith. However, as the fleet sailed into the English Channel, history began to change in ways that neither Spain nor England expected. The campaign that followed became one of the most famous naval battles ever fought. It marked the beginning of the end of Spain's control of the seas and changed the balance of power across Europe. In July of the year 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed from Lisbon and began its long voyage toward England. King Philip II had gathered what many believed was an unstoppable force. The fleet included more than 130 ships, such as large galleons, frigates, and support vessels. On board were about 30,000 soldiers and 7,000 sailors. Their mission was to defeat the English navy, land troops in England, and restore Catholic rule by removing Queen Elizabeth I. As the Armada entered the English Channel, it faced its first major obstacle. Instead of calm weather and favourable winds, powerful storms scattered the fleet and slowed its journey. The huge Spanish ships were built to be strong and durable, but they were not fast enough to move easily through the narrow waters of the Channel. This gave the smaller English ships an immediate advantage. The English fleet, commanded by Admiral Lord Howard of Effingham and supported by Sir Francis Drake, relied on quick attacks instead of direct battles. Rather than fighting the Spanish fleet head-on, the English ships sailed close enough to fire their cannons before quickly pulling away. Their speed prevented the Spanish from returning effective fire. This fighting style frustrated the Spanish commanders, who preferred close-range battles in which their larger ships could use their greater strength. One of the first important clashes happened near the coast of Plymouth. The smaller English ships carried lighter cannons that could be fired more quickly and over longer distances. They repeatedly attacked the Spanish fleet while staying out of reach. Because the Armada was so large and slow, it could not respond effectively, and eventually pulled back under the cover of darkness. The Spanish commanders still hoped to fight one great battle that would allow them to use the full power of their fleet. This opportunity came near Gravelines, off the coast of France, in August of the year 1588. There, the Spanish ships formed their traditional battle line and prepared for a direct confrontation. The English had already planned a clever surprise. During the night before the battle, they sent several old ships filled with flammable materials towards the Spanish fleet. These fire ships were set on fire and allowed to drift with the wind. Seeing the burning vessels coming toward them, the Spanish sailors panicked. Fearing explosions and fire, many captains cut their anchor ropes and scattered in different directions. Their carefully organized battle formation quickly fell apart. When daylight came, the English fleet took full advantage of the confusion. The English ships moved rapidly around the scattered Spanish vessels, firing their cannons again and again from a safe distance. The Spanish struggled to regroup, and their slower ships could not fight back effectively. They suffered heavy damage while the English continued their fast hit-and-run attacks. The Battle of Gravelines was not a complete destruction of the Spanish Armada, but it changed the course of the war. The fire ships, together with the English tactics, shattered the unity of the Spanish fleet. Although the Armada still possessed many powerful ships, it had lost much of its organization and fighting strength. The fleet was forced to sail north, hoping to return home by going around Scotland and through the North Sea. The retreat proved even more difficult than the battle itself. English ships continued to follow and attack the Armada whenever possible, while violent storms battered the fleet. After the fighting near Gravelines in early August of the year 1588, many Spanish ships were already badly damaged, and the sailors' confidence had been shaken. Spain had originally planned to sail around England and meet the army of the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands before launching the invasion. After the battle, that plan was no longer possible. Strong winds, rough seas, and constant English attacks forced the Spanish fleet farther north. As the Armada sailed around Scotland and Ireland, the weather became even worse. Fierce storms drove many ships onto rocks or left them badly damaged. For several weeks, the fleet struggled through dangerous seas. Many vessels sank while others were abandoned. It is believed that as many as 1/3 of the Armada was destroyed or lost during these terrible storms. By October of the year 1588, the surviving ships finally reached Spain. Out of the more than 130 ships that had begun the voyage, only about 67 returned. Thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors had died in battle, in shipwrecks, or from disease and starvation. Although King Philip II still believed the mission had been guided by God, the defeat could not be denied. Spain had suffered a terrible loss. The defeat of the Spanish Armada had lasting effects on Europe. For England, the victory greatly increased national pride and strengthened its position as an important European power. Queen Elizabeth I became celebrated as a strong and successful ruler, while the courage and skill of the English navy became famous throughout Europe. The victory also protected Protestantism in both England and the Netherlands, weakening the influence of the Catholic cause. For Spain, the defeat marked the beginning of a long period of decline. Spain remained powerful and continued to rule its colonies in the Americas while maintaining influence in the Mediterranean. However, the events of the year 1588 destroyed the belief that Spain could never be defeated. At sea, its navy was no longer seen as the strongest and most powerful in the world. The defeat also encouraged other European countries to challenge Spain's dominance. At the same time, the enormous cost of the failed campaign, together with the expense of maintaining its vast empire, increased Spain's debts and created serious economic problems. The loss of the Armada showed that Spain could no longer depend on its navy alone to protect its empire. This marked a major change in European history, as England, France, and the Dutch Republic gradually grew into powerful naval and colonial nations, while Spain's influence slowly declined. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588 had a deep emotional effect on both the people of Spain and the rest of Europe. For Spain, the loss was a serious blow to national pride and showed that its dream of building and protecting a great empire was no longer as secure as it had once seemed. For many other European countries, the victory over the Armada was the first major defeat Spain had suffered after almost 100 years of continuous success and military victories. In the years that followed, Spain's military strength slowly began to weaken, and its empire entered a long period of gradual decline. Although Spain continued to rule vast lands and remained an important power in Europe and the Americas, for many centuries, the defeat of the Armada marked the beginning of a new chapter in its history. From that point onward, Spain faced growing competition from powerful, seafaring nations such as England the Netherlands and France, whose influence on the world's oceans and in international affairs continued to grow while Spain's dominance slowly faded. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, was one of the longest, most destructive and most complicated wars in European history. It lasted through much of the 17th century and completely changed the balance of power in Europe. The conflict not only reshaped the political map of the continent, but also marked the beginning of the end of Spain's dominance in Europe. At its heart, the war was a struggle for both religious and political control. On one side were the Catholic Habsburg rulers of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. On the other side was a growing alliance of Protestant states, along with some Catholic countries that had become increasingly opposed to Spain's growing power. Although religion was an important cause of the conflict, many countries also fought to protect or expand their own political interests. The roots of the war stretched back to the early 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation divided Europe into Catholic and Protestant regions. These religious divisions led to many smaller wars over the years, and the 30 Years' War became the greatest and most violent of them all. Earlier, the Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, had temporarily reduced tensions by allowing the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire to choose whether their lands would follow the Catholic or Protestant faith. However, this agreement failed to remove the deep distrust between the two sides. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation only increased both religious and political rivalries, leaving much of Europe unstable. The war officially began in 1618 with the defenestration of Prague. During this event, Protestant nobles in Bohemia threw Catholic officials out of a castle window. Although the officials survived, the incident became a powerful symbol of the hatred between the two religious groups and quickly sparked open war. Soon, the Catholic Habsburg rulers of the Holy Roman Empire were fighting against a growing Protestant alliance. What started as a local conflict in Bohemia soon spread across Europe as powerful nations, including Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic, joined the fighting. Each country entered the war for its own reasons. Some wanted to defend their religion, while others hoped to gain political influence or weaken their rivals. At this time, Spain was ruled by Philip IV. He strongly supported the Habsburg family and believed the war was necessary to defend Catholicism and stop the spread of Protestantism. Spain had already been fighting wars in the Low Countries and against France, so the 30 Years' War became another part of its long effort to keep control of Europe, especially in the Low Countries and around the Mediterranean Sea. Spain also entered the war because of family ties. The Habsburg dynasty ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and both branches of the family wanted to preserve Catholic power across Europe. However, Spain was no longer as strong as it had once been. Earlier defeats, especially the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588, had weakened its military strength, and its armies were already fighting on many fronts. Even so, Spanish soldiers played an important role during the early years of the war, especially in the Low Countries, where they fought Protestant forces and worked to keep the region under Catholic Habsburg control. Although Spain was still one of Europe's strongest military powers at the beginning of the war, it faced serious problems at home and abroad. Years of expensive wars, including the 80 Years' War against the Dutch Republic, had drained the country's wealth and left it with huge debts. As a result, Spain's army was no longer as powerful as it had been during its golden age. Philip IV remained committed to the Catholic cause, but he faced growing political and financial difficulties. He depended heavily on his chief minister, Gaspar Guzman, to manage the empire's military campaigns and its struggling finances, making Spain's involvement in the war even more complicated. When Spain entered the 30 Years' War, it did so with both hope and desperation. It wanted to strengthen its position in Europe and protect the Habsburg dynasty. But it was also trying to hold together an empire that was slowly losing its power. The war eventually became a major turning point in Spanish history. It marked the beginning of Spain's decline as both a military power and a global empire. Spain could no longer dominate Europe as it had in the past, and the 30 Years' War became one of the main events that led to the loss of its supremacy. When the war began in 1618, Spain's first goal was to defend the interests of the Habsburg family throughout Europe. Under Philip IV, Spain was fighting not only to protect the Catholic faith, but also to keep its leading position within the Holy Roman Empire and maintain control of the Spanish Netherlands. The Spanish Netherlands, which largely covers present-day Belgium, had been an important centre of conflict for many years. Spain had controlled the region since the 16th century, when Philip II tried to crush the Protestant Dutch rebellion. The area remained one of the most valuable and strategically important territories of the Spanish Habsburgs. Although much of the early fighting in the 30 Years' War took place inside the Holy Roman Empire, Spain's struggle to hold on to the Low Countries was just as important for the survival of Habsburg power in Europe. Meanwhile, the Dutch revolt, which lasted from 1568 to 1648, had already continued for many decades. The Protestant Dutch Republic was determined to gain complete independence from Spanish rule. By the early 17th century, Spain had regained some stability in the region, but it was still fighting the Dutch for control of Flanders, Holland, and other wealthy and economically important provinces. As the 30 Years' War spread across Europe, Spain sent large armies to the Low Countries to strengthen the Catholic side and stop the spread of Protestant influence. The conflict became a wider struggle in which Spanish forces fought not only against the Protestant Dutch, but also against the French, who supported the Protestant powers because they wanted to reduce the influence of the Habsburg dynasty. The Spanish army was led by experienced commanders such as Ambrosio Spinola, who became one of Spain's most important military leaders during the early years of the war. His forces were responsible for defending Spain's territories in the Low Countries against both local rebellions and attacks from foreign enemies. In the year 1621, Spain officially entered a new stage of the 30 Years' War when the 12 years' truce with the Dutch Republic came to an end. Fighting broke out again across the Low Countries, beginning a new and costly period of war for Spain. Although the Spanish army was one of the strongest and most experienced forces in Europe, it faced growing challenges. At first, Spain won several important victories, but it could not completely defeat the determined Dutch resistance. As the war continued, the expensive military campaigns placed an even greater burden on Spain's already overstretched finances and resources. At the same time, the conflict in the Holy Roman Empire became both a religious and political struggle. The war had begun as a clash between Catholic and Protestant states within the empire. Spain, as one of Europe's leading Catholic powers, believed it had a duty to defend both the Habsburg family and the Catholic Church. Emperor Ferdinand II was determined to restore Catholicism in Protestant territories, and he asked Spain for military support. King Philip IV sent Spanish troops to help the emperor and the Catholic cause. During the early years of the war, Spain achieved many successes. Spanish soldiers, together with their Catholic allies, played an important role in winning battles for the Catholic League. They helped crush several Protestant uprisings and defended important Catholic strongholds across Central Europe. Spain's military support strengthened Ferdinand II's position and helped stabilize the Holy Roman Empire for a time. However, this also drew Spain deeper into a conflict that was spreading far beyond the empire's original borders. As the years passed, the cost of Spain's involvement became increasingly clear. Its armies were fighting on several fronts, and the constant warfare placed enormous pressure on the country's economy. By the middle of the 1620s, Spain was already facing serious financial problems because of the huge cost of supporting the Catholic cause throughout Europe. These money problems, together with the growing exhaustion of its soldiers, made Spain's position much weaker. The early years of the 30 Years' War represented the height of Spain's military involvement in both the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, they also marked the beginning of Spain's gradual decline. Long military campaigns, limited resources, and growing political problems slowly weakened Spain's ability to remain the most powerful military and political nation in Europe. By the early 1640s, Spain had reached a turning point in the war. Although it had enjoyed many victories at the beginning of the conflict, its army was becoming weaker because of financial troubles and increasing pressure from rival European powers. One of the most important events in Spain's decline came in the year 1643 at the Battle of Rocroi, fought in the French Ardennes. This battle marked the end of Spain's long period of military dominance and signaled the rise of France as Europe's leading military power. The battle was fought between the Spanish Habsburgs, who had once been the strongest military force on the continent, and the French, who had become Spain's greatest rival. The Spanish army was commanded by Francisco de Melo and included the famous Spanish tercios, highly disciplined infantry formations that had formed the backbone of Spain's military strength since the 16th century. These tercios had earned a fearsome reputation in earlier victories, including the Battle of Lepanto in the year 1571, as well as many campaigns in the Low Countries. However, by the time of the Battle of Rocroi, Spain was no longer the powerful nation it had once been. Its army was tired, short of soldiers, and struggling to match the growing strength of France. The French army was led by the young and talented Louis II de Bourbon, Prince of Condé. Although the French force was smaller, it was well organized, highly motivated, and had recently won several victories. France also had a stronger economy, allowing it to spend more money on better training, improved weapons, and modern military tactics. During the battle, the French launched a carefully planned attack that outflanked the Spanish lines. Their faster and more flexible tactics overwhelmed the famous Spanish tercios. French cavalry played a key role by breaking up the Spanish formations, while the Spanish infantry struggled to adapt to the changing battlefield. The once feared tercios were defeated and forced to retreat. The defeat at Rocroi was much more than a military setback. It was a devastating psychological blow that showed the world Spain was no longer unbeatable. The legendary Spanish tercios, once considered the finest infantry in Europe, had been broken. Spain's reputation as the continent's greatest military power was seriously damaged, while France emerged as the new leading military and political power. The defeat also had serious consequences for Spain's role in the 30 Years' War. After many years of fighting, Spain's finances were so weak that rebuilding its army became extremely difficult. France took full advantage of its victory, gaining momentum and further weakening Spain's position. Although Spain continued fighting for several more years, the Battle of Rocroi clearly marked the beginning of the end of its dominance in Europe. Over the following years, France continued to win important victories, eventually forcing Spain into a defensive position. This struggle finally ended with the Treaty of the Pyrenees in the year 1659. Under the treaty, Spain gave several important territories to France, bringing an end to Spain's long period of European dominance and confirming France as the continent's leading power. The Treaty of Westphalia, signed in the year 1648, officially ended the 30 Years' War and brought major changes to Europe. Although Spain remained involved in some fighting after the treaty, the agreement transformed the political map of Europe and clearly showed that Spain's position as the continent's strongest power had come to an end. The 30 Years' War had devastated much of Central Europe. It began as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, but eventually drew in many of Europe's greatest powers, including Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, France, and the Dutch Republic. After decades of destruction, countless towns and villages had been ruined, millions of lives had been disrupted, and the economies of many countries had been severely damaged. By the middle of the 1640s, the war had become an unbearable burden for Spain. Years of military campaigns had drained its treasury and weakened its armies. Spain had entered the war hoping to defend the Habsburg rulers and preserve Catholic influence across Europe. Instead, it found itself exhausted and increasingly unable to compete with its rivals. The defeat at Rocroi had destroyed the Spanish army's reputation, while the country's financial problems continued to grow. King Philip IV faced increasing pressure, both from unrest within Spain and from powerful enemies abroad. The Treaty of Westphalia had several major effects on Spain. One of the most important was the loss of Spanish influence in Germany. The treaty greatly weakened the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor and gave the German states much greater independence, especially the Protestant states. France also gained greater influence within the empire. Spain's Habsburg relatives had hoped to keep the Holy Roman Empire united under strong central authority, but the treaty made that impossible. Spain's influence in German affairs declined sharply, the Catholic alliance became much weaker, and the Protestant states gained far greater freedom to manage their own political and religious affairs. Another major result of the treaty was the official recognition of the independence of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had been fighting Spain since the 16th century in a long struggle for freedom. With the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, Spain finally accepted Dutch independence, bringing an end to its long and unsuccessful effort to bring the Netherlands back under Spanish rule. The Dutch Republic, now an independent nation, quickly became one of Spain's greatest rivals at sea and in trade. As Dutch merchants and sailors expanded their influence across the world, Spain's power in Europe continued to weaken. Spain also lost important lands to France. Under the terms of the peace agreement, Spain was forced to give up territories in the Spanish Netherlands, including Artois, French Flanders, and Roussillon. Losing these regions greatly weakened Spain's strategic position in Europe, especially in the Low Countries, where it had been a dominant power for many centuries. These territorial losses also confirmed France's growing strength and marked a major change in the balance of power across Europe. Spain's military strength was also fading. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588 had already ended Spain's unquestioned control of the seas. By the time the Arran-Richimamami was signed in the year 1648, Spain's army had also become much weaker. The Spanish Habsburg rulers struggled to manage both their military and their finances. Important defeats, especially the Rhône, together with a shortage of money, made it impossible for Spain to continue fighting long and costly wars. As a result, Spain was no longer the dominant military power it had been during the 16th century. The Peace of Westphalia also damaged Spain's reputation in Europe. Although Spain still controlled a large overseas empire, the treaty showed that its influence in European affairs had greatly declined. It confirmed that Spain could no longer shape European politics as it had in the past. The loss of the Netherlands and the weakening of Habsburg influence in the Sea proved that Spain no longer had the power to control the outcome of major European conflicts. The Peace of Westphalia officially ended the Paix Sainte, besieged, and opened a new period of diplomacy, where European nations tried to maintain a balance of power instead of allowing one country to dominate. Spain remained an important global empire, but its position as the leading power in Europe had come to an end. At the same time, France emerged as the strongest political force on the continent. This change began a long rivalry between Spain and France that shaped European history throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from the year 1618 to the year 1648, became one of the most important turning points in European history. For Spain, it marked the beginning of the end of its dominance in Europe. Although Spain continued to rule a vast overseas empire for many years, the war exposed serious weaknesses in its military, economy, and political influence. One of the most immediate effects of the war was severe economic hardship. By this time, Spain had already built up huge debts after many years of expensive wars and heavy military spending. The country depended heavily on gold and silver from the Americas, but these supplies were beginning to decrease. At the same time, rising prices reduced the value of the wealth that continued to arrive. The cost of fighting long wars, especially in the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire, placed an enormous burden on Spain's finances. Spain's economy became even weaker because of poor management and the failure to develop industries at home. Instead of using wealth from its colonies to improve roads, businesses, farming, and manufacturing, Spain continued to spend much of its money on military campaigns. This made the country highly vulnerable whenever the flow of precious metals from the Americas slowed. Inflation caused by too much gold and silver in circulation made conditions even worse. Spain's debts kept growing, making it increasingly difficult to pay its soldiers or defend its empire. These financial problems directly affected Spain's military. The defeat at the Battle of Rocroi in the year 1643 clearly showed that Spain could no longer support the powerful armies that had once made it the strongest military nation in Europe. As Spain's resources became exhausted, its influence in both Europe and the Americas steadily declined. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in the year 1648, strengthened this decline even further. Spain lost more territory to France, while the Dutch Republic gained full international recognition as an independent state. These changes greatly reduced Spain's importance in European politics. The Battle of Rocroi also symbolized a much larger change in Europe's military balance. Throughout most of the 16th century, Spain had possessed the strongest army in Europe. Its famous Spanish tercios were widely respected as some of the finest soldiers on the continent. However, by the middle of the 17th century, this military advantage had disappeared. France's victory at Rocroi marked the end of the long period during which the Spanish tercios had dominated European battlefields. The decline of Spain's military power hurt both its reputation and its ability to defend its empire. As France, England, and the Dutch Republic became stronger, Spain found it increasingly difficult to protect its territories or influence events across Europe. The loss of lands in the Low Countries and the growing power of France further reduced Spain's influence. Over the following decades, Spain's military resources remained stretched, and it never recovered the strength it had enjoyed during its golden age. Although Spain still ruled a vast empire in the Americas, the 30 Years' War and its aftermath revealed deep weaknesses in the empire's foundations. The loss of European territories and the constant drain of money caused by warfare made it much harder for Spain to govern and defend its distant colonies. As Spain faced economic problems and military defeats, other European powers, especially England and the Dutch Republic, expanded into areas that had once been controlled by Spain in the Americas and the Philippines. Their growing influence slowly reduced Spain's control over world trade and colonial expansion. During the years that followed, Spain also faced rebellions and growing resistance within its colonies. Pirates and privateers, especially those from England and the Netherlands, regularly attacked Spanish ships and coastal settlements, causing further damage to Spain's empire. By the 18th century, Spain still possessed a large overseas empire, but it had lost much of the power, wealth, and influence that had once made it the greatest empire in the world. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was facing a serious economic crisis that helped bring about the eventual fall of the Habsburg dynasty in the country. During much of the 16th century, Spain had become extremely wealthy because of the huge amounts of gold and silver arriving from its colonies in the Americas. However, by the end of the 17th century, this great source of wealth had turned into a major economic problem. Spain's decline was closely connected to its failure to manage its riches wisely and to the long-standing weaknesses in its economy. The greatest source of Spain's wealth during its golden age was its American colonies. Gold and silver from the mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia and from Mexico poured into the country. At first, this made Spain one of the richest kingdoms in Europe. However, by the 17th century, the constant flow of precious metals caused high inflation and reduced the value of the country's money. As more money entered the economy, the prices of goods rose sharply, making it harder for both the government and ordinary people to afford everyday necessities. Although Spain possessed enormous amounts of gold and silver, it failed to build a strong economy at home. The government did not invest enough in farming, manufacturing, trade, or other industries that could have created lasting wealth. Instead, the country depended too heavily on the riches coming from its colonies. Spain also spent enormous amounts of money on war. The Habsburg rulers fought many costly conflicts across Europe and the Mediterranean, including the 30 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, and several rebellions within the kingdom. To pay for these wars, the monarchy borrowed huge sums of money. As the debts grew larger, the Spanish crown found it increasingly difficult to repay what it owed. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was constantly spending more than it earned, and could no longer support the luxurious lifestyle and heavy military expenses that had once shown its power. Even though Spain ruled a vast empire, it had little economic progress to show for its wealth. Many nobles paid no taxes, while much of the farming population worked under large landowners. This system made agriculture inefficient and slowed economic growth. Spain also lacked a strong manufacturing industry, forcing it to buy many finished goods from countries such as France, England, and the Dutch Republic. Because the monarchy failed to carry out important economic reforms, these problems continued to grow worse. The Habsburg rulers focused more on protecting their military strength and defending the Catholic faith, than on improving industry, trade, and the economy. As a result, Spain struggled to adjust to changing conditions in Europe. The country became more dependent on loans from foreign lenders, leading to repeated bankruptcies and failures to repay its debts during the late 17th century. These financial problems weakened the monarchy and made it harder to control its huge empire. Spain's economic crisis was not caused by poor leadership alone. It was also the result of deep problems that had been developing for many years. Inflation, endless military spending, and weak industrial growth combined to create a long period of economic decline. This weakened the Habsburg monarchy, leaving it unable to deal with the growing challenges of ruling such a large empire. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's financial system was in complete disorder. Although the monarchy had once been the richest in Europe because of its American colonies, it had become heavily dependent on foreign loans to pay for its armies and maintain its empire. The constant need for money to fight wars and keep troops across Europe emptied the royal treasury and trapped Spain in a cycle of debt from which it could not escape. One of Spain's biggest problems was its weak tax system. Even with the wealth arriving from the Americas, the government's income was not enough to pay for its huge military and the expensive royal court. Since the noble class paid little or no taxes, they contributed very little to the kingdom's finances. Instead, the burden fell mainly on peasants and poor people living in towns and cities. Many of them could not afford the heavy taxes that were imposed to support the crown's endless wars. This created widespread anger and made the economic system unfair and unsustainable. Spain's dependence on foreign loans made the crisis even worse. Because the government relied so heavily on borrowing, it became increasingly tied to foreign bankers and lenders. By the early 17th century, Spain had already begun failing to repay its loans, causing a series of bankruptcies. In 1596, Spain declared its first bankruptcy after it could no longer pay the interest on its debts. This pattern continued throughout the century. By the 1620s, the government faced constant budget shortages that could not be solved through taxes or other sources of income. Spain had used up much of its credit, and foreign lenders became unwilling to lend more money to a kingdom with a poor record of repayment. The monarchy was forced to take desperate measures, including reducing military spending and shrinking the size of its army. These actions weakened Spain's position in the wars it was fighting. Philip IV of Spain tried to solve the growing financial crisis, but found himself trapped between the demands of the military and the country's worsening economic problems. The debt crisis reached another major turning point in 1647, when Spain declared its second bankruptcy. The kingdom had accumulated so much debt that it could no longer meet its financial obligations. As Spain failed to repay its loans, foreign lenders demanded their money back or faced losing their investments. Spain's inability to repay its debts badly damaged its reputation and made it even more difficult to borrow money in the future. The collapse of Spain's finances had serious consequences. To meet its expenses, the government printed more money, which caused even higher inflation and further reduced the value of the currency. As prices continued to rise, people could buy less with the money they had. Even many nobles who had long enjoyed freedom from taxes saw their wealth lose value because of inflation. The greatest suffering, however, fell on workers and peasants, who faced increasing poverty, food shortages, and social unrest. The monarchy's poor financial management created a chain reaction that weakened Spain's military strength, political power, and international reputation. As Spain struggled to pay its debts and finance its wars, its influence across Europe steadily declined. Meanwhile, France, England, and the Dutch Republic strengthened their economies and armed forces. Spain's once powerful empire gradually fell apart under the crushing weight of its growing debt and long-standing economic problems. By the late 17th century, Spain's economic problems became even worse because of internal rebellions and unrest in different parts of the country. Heavy debt, rising prices, and a weakening military made it harder for the Habsburg monarchy to rule its enormous empire. Economic decline, government corruption, and growing inequality caused widespread anger throughout Spain's territories. As a result, several major revolts broke out, weakening the authority of the Spanish crown even further. One of the most important uprisings was the Catalan Revolt, which began in the year 1640. Catalonia was a rich region in northeastern Spain with its own strong culture and traditions. For many years, its people had opposed the Spanish monarchy's attempts to increase central control. When King Philip IV raised taxes to pay for costly wars, many Catalans, already suffering from economic hardship, rebelled. The revolt became even more intense because Spanish troops occupied Catalonia during the 30 Years' War, something many local people saw as an attack on their rights and independence. The rebellion was marked by fierce fighting and strong resistance against Spanish soldiers. During the conflict, Catalonia briefly declared its independence and joined forces with France in the hope of escaping Spanish rule. Spain eventually crushed the rebellion, but it exposed the deep divisions within the kingdom and showed how much resentment existed in the outer regions of the empire. The conflict ended with the Treaty of the Pyrenees in the year 1659, which concluded the war between France and Spain. Under the treaty, Spain gave up territory in Catalonia to France. This weakened Spain's control over an important region and showed that France was becoming the new leading power in Europe while Spain continued to decline. Another major challenge was the Portuguese Restoration War, which lasted from the year 1640 to the year 1668. Portugal had been ruled by Spain since the Union of the Crowns in the year 1580. Many Portuguese people were unhappy with Spanish rule because Spain ignored Portuguese interests while demanding resources and taxes. Economic difficulties made these frustrations even worse. In the year 1640, Portuguese nobles and soldiers revolted against Spain, declared Portugal independent, and crowned John IV as their new king. The war continued for almost 30 years. Although Spain fought hard to regain control, Portugal finally secured its independence with the Treaty of Lisbon in the year 1668. Losing Portugal was a major blow to Spain because it reduced the size of its empire and proved that the Habsburg monarchy was steadily losing its strength. Other regions also experienced unrest. The Kingdom of Aragon faced its own rebellion between the years 1646 and 1648. Like the people of Catalonia, the people of Aragon were angry about heavy taxes, economic hardship, and the monarchy's growing control over regional affairs. Local nobles resisted the king's attempts to centralize power and demanded greater independence. Although Spain eventually defeated the revolt, it further weakened the authority of the Habsburg rulers and revealed how widespread dissatisfaction had become. These rebellions were not isolated events. They were part of a much larger pattern, showing that loyalty to the Spanish crown was fading. Spain's vast empire had become increasingly difficult to govern. Many regions with their own cultures, economies, and political traditions wanted greater freedom or complete independence. The Habsburg monarchy was already struggling with financial problems and military defeats, leaving it unable to stop these uprisings effectively. As a result, Spain gradually lost control over many parts of its once powerful empire. The revolts also had lasting social and political effects. They showed that many people no longer trusted the monarchy. The growing gap between the wealthy nobles and ordinary people, together with the increasing influence of local leaders, weakened the power of the central government. As regional elites gained more authority, Spain became more divided. This growing fragmentation played an important role in the eventual collapse of Habsburg rule. The final years of the Habsburg dynasty were dominated by the reign of Charles II, who ruled from the year 1665 until the year 1700. He was the last Spanish ruler from the Habsburg family. His reign was filled with personal struggles, political instability, and a growing crisis over who would inherit the throne. These problems eventually brought Habsburg rule in Spain to an end and opened the way for the Bourbon dynasty. Charles II suffered from serious health problems throughout his life. Born in the year 1661, he was the result of generations of marriages between close relatives within the Habsburg family. These repeated marriages caused severe physical and mental health problems. His learning abilities developed slowly, and he suffered from many illnesses that made it difficult for him to rule effectively. His poor health became a symbol of Spain's own decline because his weak leadership allowed the country's problems to grow even worse. When Charles became king in the year 1665, he inherited an empire that was already in serious decline. Spain had suffered decades of military defeats, financial mismanagement, and regional rebellions. Charles lacked the political skill and military leadership needed to solve these growing problems. During his reign, powerful courtiers and foreign advisors gained greater influence as divisions within the Spanish government became even deeper. One of the greatest challenges of Charles's reign was the succession crisis. Since he had no children, there was growing concern about who would inherit the Spanish throne. This question was important not only for Spain, but for all of Europe, because the Spanish king ruled vast territories across Europe and the Americas. European powers eagerly tried to influence the future succession to protect their own interests. Charles's marriages produced no children, and his inability to leave an heir created uncertainty throughout the kingdom. As the years passed, it became clear that the throne would have to pass to a distant relative. This uncertainty weakened the government and increased political tensions. By the year 1700, everyone knew that Charles would die without a direct heir, making a major conflict almost unavoidable. Charles II died in the year 1700. In his will, he left the Spanish throne to Philip of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. This decision caused great controversy, because many European nations feared that France and Spain might unite under one ruling family, giving France enormous power. Charles's death without a direct heir immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from the year 1701 until the year 1714. The war decided who would inherit the Spanish throne and marked the end of Habsburg rule in Spain. It also brought the Bourbon dynasty to power under King Philip V. The conflict became a struggle between Philip of Anjou and Archduke Charles of Austria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Both claimed to be the rightful ruler of Spain. France strongly supported Philip, while England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several other European states supported Archduke Charles. These countries feared that if France and Spain were united under the Bourbon family, France would become far too powerful and upset the balance of power in Europe. The war spread across many parts of Europe. Major battles were fought in Spain, Italy, the Low Countries, and Germany. The fighting was long and destructive, causing great suffering throughout Spain. Although Philip V received military support from France, he faced determined opposition from the powerful European alliance. The war exhausted Spain's economy, drained its treasury, and left the country politically divided. This conflict was about much more than choosing the next king of Spain. It was also a struggle over the future balance of power in Europe and control of Spain's enormous overseas empire. European nations wanted to prevent any single country from becoming too powerful, and Spain became the center of that struggle. Throughout the war, Spain suffered repeated military defeats. The enormous cost of maintaining armies and fighting battles placed even greater pressure on the country's already weak finances. By the end of the conflict, Spain's resources had been almost completely exhausted. The war finally ended in the year 1714 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. The treaty officially recognized Philip V as the lawful king of Spain. However, Spain was forced to give up many important territories. Gibraltar was handed over to Britain, giving the British an important naval base that strengthened their control of the Mediterranean Sea. Spain also lost several territories in Italy to Austria, while its overseas empire became increasingly exposed to attacks from rival European powers. The Treaty of Utrecht did far more than settle the succession dispute. It reshaped the political balance of Europe by ensuring that France and Spain would never be ruled by the same monarch. This agreement prevented the creation of an overly powerful Bourbon Empire and helped maintain the balance between Europe's major powers. Although the Bourbon dynasty now ruled Spain, the country would never again enjoy the same level of influence and dominance that it had achieved during the height of Habsburg rule. Before the rewriting, the Bourbon victory became a major turning point in Spanish history. When Philip V became king, he began the rule of the Bourbon dynasty, which still reigns in Spain today. Even though he secured the throne, the country paid a heavy price. The long and destructive war weakened Spain's economy, reduced its military strength, and caused the empire to enter a long period of decline. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. This treaty brought the rule of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain to an end and confirmed the rise of the Bourbon dynasty under Philip V. This change transformed Spain's political system and began a new era that would shape the Spanish monarchy for centuries. Philip V, born Philip of Anjou, was the grandson of Louis XIV of France and the son of the Duke of Anjou. He was chosen by Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, to inherit the Spanish throne. Charles died without children, creating a succession crisis. Since the Spanish crown had been ruled by the Habsburg family for many generations, his decision to leave the throne to a French Bourbon prince, instead of another Habsburg relative, was highly controversial. Many European nations feared that France and Spain would become united under one Bourbon ruler, giving the new kingdom too much power. This fear led to the War of the Spanish Succession. Great Britain, the Dutch Republic and the Habsburgs formed an alliance to support Archduke Charles of Austria as the rival claimant to the Spanish throne. After years of bitter fighting, Philip's claim was accepted. The Treaty of Utrecht officially recognized him as King of Spain, but the victory came at a great cost. Spain was forced to surrender several important territories in Europe, making the country much weaker. When Philip became king in 1700, he inherited a nation that had been devastated by years of war. The economy was in ruins, political divisions were deep, and many people had suffered greatly. Several regions remained rebellious, especially Catalonia, which had supported the Habsburg side during the war. This opposition created serious internal problems that Philip had to deal with throughout his reign. During his early years as king, Philip had to balance French influence with the need to establish his own authority in Spain. He introduced many political reforms designed to strengthen the monarchy and reduce the independence of Spain's different regions. Guided by French advisors, he gradually replaced the old decentralized system which had allowed regions such as Catalonia and Aragon to govern many of their own affairs. One of Philip's most important reforms was the removal of the old medieval regional privileges that gave Catalonia and Aragon special rights. These traditional laws allowed the regions to control many of their own legal military and financial matters. Philip believed these privileges prevented Spain from becoming a strong and united kingdom. His decision to abolish them created strong resistance and increased tensions across the country. Although Philip had won the war, peace did not end his political struggles. Bringing all parts of Spain under the direct authority of the crown remained one of the greatest challenges of his reign and continued to create conflict throughout the Bourbon period. After taking the throne, Philip inherited a kingdom that was exhausted by war. Although he had secured the crown, Spain remained divided internally and faced growing pressure from other European powers. The Treaty of Utrecht confirmed his right to rule, but it also forced Spain to give up valuable territories, reducing its influence across Europe. At the same time, long-standing divisions between Castile and regions such as Catalonia and Aragon made it difficult for Philip to unite the country. To solve these problems, Philip introduced a series of reforms aimed at creating a stronger central government. Inspired by his grandfather, Louis XIV of France, he believed Spain could only survive if royal authority became stronger and regional governments became weaker. Under the Habsburgs, regions such as Catalonia, Aragon and Navarre had enjoyed considerable independence. Philip wanted to replace this system with a single unified state. His most important reform was the abolition of the old regional privileges known as the fueros. These laws had allowed many regions to govern themselves, collect taxes, maintain their own legal systems, and even control local military forces. Philip and his advisors quickly removed these privileges to create a more uniform government across Spain. In 1716, Philip introduced the Nueva Planta decrees, a series of laws that greatly increased the power of the monarchy. These decrees abolished the separate governments and legal systems of Catalonia, Aragon, and the Kingdom of Valencia, and brought them under the Castilian system of administration. They also expanded the authority of the Royal Council of Castile across the kingdom, giving the king much greater control over Spain. The Nueva Planta decrees were intended to unite Spain under one government, but they were deeply unpopular in many regions. Catalonia, which had strongly opposed Bourbon rule during the war, resisted these reforms fiercely. In 1714, after a long and brutal siege, Barcelona fell to Bourbon forces, ending the Catalan resistance and strengthening Philip's authority. Even so, many Catalans remained bitter over the loss of their traditional rights, and resentment toward the Bourbon monarchy continued for many years. Although Philip's reforms greatly reduced regional independence and strengthened the monarchy, they did not solve all of Spain's problems. The country still faced severe economic hardship caused by years of war, territorial losses, and internal unrest. These difficulties made it hard for the government to carry out further reforms. Even so, Philip's reign marked an important turning point. Spain changed from the decentralized system of the Habsburgs to a more centralized and absolute monarchy similar to that of France. Despite strong opposition, these reforms laid the foundation for the Bourbon dynasty's long rule over Spain. Even after the political reforms, Spain's economy remained in serious trouble during the early 18th century. The War of the Spanish Succession had left the kingdom heavily damaged. The government was deeply in debt, trade had declined, industries were struggling, and rebuilding the country proved extremely difficult. Philip faced the enormous task of restoring Spain's finances while trying to maintain his authority over an empire that was steadily losing power. One of the greatest problems he inherited was the enormous national debt. Years of war had emptied the royal treasury, and the Spanish crown owed large amounts of money to foreign lenders. The Treaty of Utrecht added to these problems by forcing Spain to surrender valuable territories, including the Spanish Netherlands, Gibraltar, and Naples. Losing these lands meant losing important sources of taxes, trade, and income. Spain continued to depend heavily on wealth from its American colonies, but mining in places such as Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, and Mexico became less productive and more expensive. At the same time, Spain still had to maintain armies and officials across its overseas empire while also trying to improve conditions at home. These growing expenses placed even more pressure on the government's finances. Inflation made matters worse. To cover its debts, the government printed more paper money, reducing the value of the currency and increasing prices. Agriculture remained the country's main economic activity, but farming methods changed very little, and there was little investment in industry or new technology. As a result, productivity stayed low. The tax system also placed much of the burden on ordinary people, creating widespread anger and dissatisfaction. Philip tried to improve the economy by introducing reforms based on the more efficient French system. His advisors proposed new taxes and wanted to reduce the tax exemptions enjoyed by the nobility. However, these reforms met fierce resistance from powerful nobles and from leaders in regions such as Catalonia and Aragon, who feared that greater centralization would reduce their remaining freedoms. Throughout Philip's reign, balancing the needs of the state with the demands of the privileged classes remained one of his greatest challenges. As Spain's financial problems continued, its influence in Europe declined further. France, Spain's closest ally, was also facing economic difficulties. Constant wars and weak domestic reforms left both countries vulnerable, while Britain and the Dutch Republic became stronger and more prosperous. Although Philip achieved some success in improving government administration, he never fully solved Spain's financial crisis. The country continued to rely on foreign loans, and its outdated economic system remained largely unchanged. As a result, Spain never fully recovered from the damage caused by the War of the Spanish Succession. Economic weakness continued throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century, while Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic increasingly became Europe's leading powers. After the war and the Treaty of Utrecht, Philip focused on strengthening the monarchy and securing his rule. Inspired by the example of Louis XIV of France, he believed that Spain needed a powerful central government. For centuries, Spain had been a collection of different kingdoms, each with its own laws, traditions, and political institutions. The Habsburg rulers had allowed these regions to keep much of their independence, but Philip believed this system weakened the country. In 1715, he introduced the Nueva Planta decrees, which became the foundation of his centralization program. These laws abolished the traditional regional privileges, or fueros, of Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia. Local governments and institutions were replaced with a centralized administration controlled directly by the Crown. The Royal Council of Castile extended its authority into regions that had previously governed themselves. These reforms greatly strengthened Philip's control over Spain, but they also provoked strong resistance. Many people in Catalonia believed the loss of their traditional rights threatened their identity and historical freedoms. Even so, Philip succeeded in reducing the power of regional nobles and local assemblies, known as the Cortes, by transferring more authority to royal governors and officials appointed by the Crown. Philip's goal was to create a stronger and more absolute monarchy in which the king held supreme authority. This represented a major break from the Habsburg system, which had depended on cooperation with powerful regional governments and local elites. His reforms permanently changed the structure of the Spanish state and established the centralized system that became the foundation of Bourbon rule for generations to come. After the Bourbon family came to power under King Philip V, Spain became more centralized, and several reforms were introduced. However, during the 18th century, the Spanish monarchy faced growing political and economic problems. Although the country became more stable after the War of the Spanish Succession, Spain slowly entered a long period of decline that continued into the 19th century. Foreign wars, internal conflicts, and poor leadership all made the situation worse. Even though the Bourbon rulers had stronger control over the country than the earlier Habsburg kings, Spain still suffered from a weak economy, strong regional divisions, and repeated military failures. One of Spain's biggest problems was its failure to modernize its economy. While countries such as Britain and France were becoming richer through the Industrial Revolution and expanding their industries, Spain remained largely dependent on old farming methods. The country failed to build strong local industries, making its economy weak and vulnerable to outside competition. The government was also deeply in debt and depended on foreign loans to pay for its military campaigns. Spain's colonies in the Americas also faced growing economic difficulties. Britain and France challenged Spain's control of important trade routes, reducing Spanish influence. Once one of the richest empires in the world, Spain now struggled to dominate international trade. Piracy, smuggling, and illegal trade became more common because Spain could no longer properly enforce its trade monopoly. As a result, the government lost large amounts of money from its colonies. Inside Spain, the Bourbon monarchy faced increasing opposition from regions such as Catalonia and the Basque country. Many local leaders disliked the government's efforts to concentrate power in Madrid. The reforms introduced by King Philip V were never fully accepted across the country, creating tensions that continued throughout the century. Although the Bourbon kings tried to improve Spain, most of their reforms failed to solve the country's deeper problems. King Carlos III, who is often considered one of the best Bourbon rulers, encouraged freer trade, improved roads, and strengthened the Spanish navy. However, these efforts were not enough to fix Spain's weak economy. The country still depended heavily on wealth from its colonies, a system that became less reliable over time. Spain was also weakened by its involvement in European wars. During the 7 Years' War, which lasted from the mid-18th century until the early 1760s, Spain suffered a major defeat and lost Florida to Britain. Although King Carlos III later achieved some successes, Spain's position in Europe continued to decline as Britain and France became stronger. The 18th century therefore became a time of political centralization but economic stagnation. Despite Bourbon efforts to modernize the country, Spain continued to struggle with economic weakness, military defeats, and growing problems in its colonies. The Bourbon monarchy remained in power but found it increasingly difficult to keep its influence both at home and abroad. These problems prepared the way for even greater challenges during the 19th century. The early 19th century became a major turning point in Spanish history, when the country was drawn into the Napoleonic Wars. In the year 1808 invaded Spain, an event that had lasting consequences. The invasion weakened the Spanish monarchy, destroyed much of its authority, and began a long period of political instability. The Peninsular War lasted from the year 1808 until the year 1814. After conquering much of Europe, Napoleon wanted to control the Iberian Peninsula as well. Spain, ruled by King Charles IV, was already divided by political disputes, economic weakness, and public dissatisfaction. The monarchy was also struggling to manage regional demands for greater independence. By the time Napoleon invaded, Spain had already suffered military defeats and the loss of much of its colonial strength. Napoleon forced King Charles IV and his son, King Ferdinand VII, to give up the throne. He then placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people strongly opposed having a foreign ruler. Across the country, ordinary citizens, local armies, and guerrilla fighters rose in rebellion, beginning a long and brutal war against French occupation. The Peninsular War became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the period. Spanish guerrilla fighters constantly attacked French soldiers, making it extremely difficult for Napoleon's army to maintain control. Although the French won several early victories, they became trapped in a long and exhausting conflict. British forces supported the Spanish resistance by providing troops and fighting alongside Spanish forces in important battles. The war caused enormous destruction across Spain. Roads, towns, farms, and public buildings were damaged or destroyed. The economy collapsed, and many government institutions stopped working effectively. Spain's colonies in Latin America also became unstable, with many beginning to seek independence, while Spain was distracted by the war. When King Ferdinand VII returned to the throne in the year 1814, he found the country in ruins. Spain's authority had been badly weakened, and the old system of absolute monarchy no longer had the same strength. The French invasion not only reduced Spain's influence in Europe, but also marked the beginning of the loss of its American empire. Although the Peninsular War ended after Napoleon's defeat in Europe, Spain recovered only slowly. King Ferdinand VII tried to restore absolute royal power and cancel many of the liberal reforms introduced during the war. His actions increased political conflict instead of bringing stability. Spain entered a period of internal division, social unrest, and growing revolutionary movements, while its colonies across Latin America continued fighting for independence. The Napoleonic Wars, which lasted from the early 19th century until the middle of the second decade of that century, greatly weakened Spain politically and economically. At the same time, Enlightenment ideas and the influence of the French Revolution encouraged people across Latin America to demand independence. When Napoleon removed King Charles IV and King Ferdinand VII from power, Spain's colonies saw an opportunity to govern themselves. Colonial officials who had already enjoyed considerable independence began pushing for even greater freedom. Spain's government was too weak and divided to stop these movements. The successful revolution in Haiti, which created the world's first independent Black Republic, inspired many people throughout Latin America. Revolutionary leaders believed they could also free their countries from Spanish rule. The first major independence movement in South America began in Argentina in the year 1810. The May Revolution established a new government independent of Spain. Soon afterward, leaders such as and led independence wars across Argentina, Chile, Peru, and many other parts of South America. Spain fought to recover its colonies but could not stop the growing demand for independence. In Mexico, the independence movement also began in the year 1810, with the Cry of Dolores, led by. Although Hidalgo was captured and executed, his movement continued under leaders such as, and, by the year 1821, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain. Spain's remaining colonies in the Caribbean, especially Cuba and Puerto Rico, stayed under Spanish rule for a longer period, but they also experienced growing demands for independence. The loss of Spain's colonies marked the end of its position as one of the world's greatest empires. Without the wealth of its overseas territories, Spain's economy weakened further, and the country lost much of its influence in international affairs. The loss of the American colonies also created serious political problems inside Spain. The monarchy no longer had the wealth it had once received from overseas, making it more difficult to govern the country. Political disagreements between liberals and conservatives became stronger. Liberals wanted constitutional government, freedom of the press, individual rights, and limits on royal power. Conservatives, supported by many nobles and church leaders, wanted to preserve the absolute monarchy and the traditional social order. These disagreements became even more serious during and after the French invasion. During the Peninsular War, representatives met at Cadiz and created the Constitution of the year 1812. This constitution limited the king's authority, created a two-house legislature, and protected several individual freedoms. Conservatives strongly opposed these reforms because they feared losing their traditional privileges. When King Ferdinand VII returned to power in the year 1814, he rejected the constitution and restored absolute rule. His decision disappointed many liberals and increased political unrest across the country. Spain became deeply divided between supporters of constitutional government and defenders of absolute monarchy. Throughout the 19th century, the military became increasingly involved in politics. Army officers often carried out military coups, known as pronunciamientos, to support or remove governments. Soldiers who had fought against Napoleon now played a major role in deciding Spain's political future. The continuing struggle between liberals and conservatives, combined with economic decline, military defeats, and the loss of the empire, left Spain politically unstable for many decades. Social unrest, military rebellions, and repeated political crises became common. Spain's failure to solve these problems marked the beginning of a long period of decline that continued throughout the 19th century. In 1820, the Riego Revolt, a military uprising led by Colonel Rafael del Riego, forced King Ferdinand VII to accept the liberal constitution once again. This short period of liberal government, known as the Liberal Triennium, brought attempts to introduce more modern and progressive reforms. However, these changes were strongly opposed by conservative groups, especially many members of the nobility and the church who wanted to preserve the old system. Political problems became even worse after Ferdinand VII died in 1833. His daughter Isabella II was declared queen, but many people rejected her right to the throne. They supported Carlos Maria Isidro, Ferdinand's brother, believing that he should become king instead. This disagreement led to the Carlist Wars, a series of civil wars that lasted for many years and made Spain even more politically unstable. These wars were not only about who should rule the country. They were also a struggle between liberals, who wanted constitutional reforms, and conservatives who wanted to keep the traditional absolute monarchy. During this period, Spain was also influenced by revolutionary ideas spreading across Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 and the rise of liberal and nationalist movements encouraged many Spaniards to demand political change. Liberals wanted either a constitutional monarchy or a republic, while conservatives, including the church and the aristocracy, fought to protect the traditional absolute monarchy. These opposing beliefs created constant political conflict throughout the 19th century, leading to repeated military uprisings and revolts, especially after the Napoleonic Wars. As social unrest grew, the military became more involved in politics, and Spain changed from a stable traditional monarchy into a divided and unstable country. By the middle of the 19th century, Spain was deeply divided by regional disputes, conflicts between different social classes, and a political system that lacked unity and stability. Liberals and conservatives continued to fight over the country's future, while the military often decided which side would gain power. The 19th century became a major turning point in Spanish history, bringing many years of political instability, slow economic growth, and social unrest. The loss of Spain's colonies in the Americas and the weakening of the monarchy led to many revolutions and internal conflicts that shaped the country's future. The Carlist Wars and the continuing struggle between liberals and conservatives remained major obstacles to achieving lasting stability after Spain's colonial decline. The Carlist Wars, fought between 1833 and 1876, were among the most important conflicts of the 19th century. They began after the death of Ferdinand VII and the accession of Isabella II to the throne. Carlos Maria Isidro, Ferdinand's brother, challenged Isabella's claim and gathered supporters who believed in a conservative and absolute monarchy. The liberals supported Isabella and wanted constitutional reforms. The fighting was fierce and lasted for many years. The Carlist forces were strongest in northern Spain, where they received support from rural farmers and traditional communities. The liberal government, backed by city leaders and the army, eventually defeated the Carlists after many years of war. Even though the liberals won, the wars left Spain deeply divided. The Carlists wanted to restore traditional values and absolute monarchy, while the liberals pushed for a constitutional government and a more modern political system. Because of these deep divisions, Spain found it difficult to achieve political unity during the 19th century. Even after the Carlist Wars ended in 1876, political unrest continued. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under Alfonso XII did not bring lasting peace. The country soon faced growing social unrest, stronger labour movements, and increasing demands for democratic reforms. More people began calling for liberal political changes and universal voting rights, especially in the growing cities. Spain's economic problems also became more serious because of the loss of its colonies and the slow growth of its industries. While many other European countries experienced rapid industrial development, Spain remained mainly an agricultural country, with a strict class system that limited economic progress and new ideas. Much of the land was controlled by large estates, called haciendas, and the country lacked the factories and industrial systems needed to compete with the more advanced economies of Europe. Poverty and inequality remained widespread in the countryside, causing frequent social unrest and making economic reform one of the country's most important political issues. Despite these difficulties, Spain still controlled Cuba and Puerto Rico, although its overseas empire continued to shrink. The loss of many of its other territories and its declining role in world trade further weakened its international influence. During the later years of the 19th century, Spain also faced growing pressure from the United States, which was expanding its influence across the Caribbean and Latin America. Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898 resulted in the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. This marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and confirmed its decline as one of Europe's leading powers.